2, Chapter 1, The Indian Ocean. The second leg of our undersea journey began. The haunting scene at the Coral Cemetery, Captain Nemo's final resting place among the ocean's abyssal depths, still echoed in my mind. No sea creature would disturb the crew of the Nautilus there, nor any man, as the captain had bitterly added. His fierce defiance of human society remained absolute. Conseil's theory that Nemo was simply a misunderstood genius seeking refuge from the world no longer satisfied me. The locked stateroom, the drugged sleep, the captain's desperate move to obscure my view of the horizon, all of it hinted at something darker. And then there was the mortally wounded man, injured in an inexplicable collision. Nemo wasn't just hiding from mankind. It seemed his formidable vessel served a more sinister purpose. I could only glimpse fragments of the truth, writing as events unfolded. On January 24th, 1868, the second officer ascended to take readings with the sextant. I joined him, puffing on a cigar, studying the intricate instrument. He didn't seem to understand French, ignoring my attempts at conversation. While he worked, one of the Nautilus's crewmen, the powerfully built sailor from our first dive at Crespo Island, emerged to clean the beacon. Its lenses, amplified by concentric rings, resembled a lighthouse, casting a brilliant horizontal beam across the water. The electric lamp, operating in a vacuum for maximum intensity and efficiency, was a testament to Nemo's resourcefulness. As we dove back beneath the waves, I retreated to the saloon. The hatch sealed, and our course was set due west into the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. For days, the Nautilus cruised at depths of 50 to 100 fathoms. Though the hours might have dragged for others, I found solace in the daily ritual of pacing the deck, breathing the invigorating air, marveling at the underwater world visible through the saloon windows, and immersing myself in the ship's library. Seabirds filled the skies, gulls, magnificent albatrosses with their raucous cries, and other long-winged species, exhausted from their migratory flights. Some were expertly hunted, providing a welcome change from our usual fare. And the fish. Through the observation panels, I witnessed a breathtaking spectacle of marine life, species I'd never encountered before. Every day brought new discoveries, new wonders, to add to my growing catalogue of the ocean's secrets. I'll focus on the Austrasians, a fish unique to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the waters of tropical America. Imagine them like underwater armadillos or turtles, encased in bony armor instead of shells. Some triangular, some square, all fascinating. I even spotted a variety about 1.5 inches long, brown-tailed and yellow-finned, with flesh so tasty I'd bet they'd thrive in fresh water. Conseil, the ever-diligent note-taker, chronicled other marvels: the red-backed, white-chested petrodon with its 3 rows of filaments, electric fish flashing with colour, the tailless ovoides banded in white, diodons, those spiky sea porcupines that puff up like pincushions, the ubiquitous seahorses, even the Pegasus fish, whose wing-like fins let them launch themselves into the air. His notes went on: the long-jawed macrognathi, painted in brilliant hues, pale calliamores with their gnarled heads, and the chaetodon, those tubular snouted sharpshooters that take down insects with a single, well-aimed drop of water. Nature's own aquatic snipers. Then there were the grotesque scorpinas, their heads studded with spikes, and the fantastical didactyls with their yellow fins and bizarre head shapes. But the most repulsive of all was the aptly named sea frog. With its lumpy, spiky body and misshapen horns, it was a creature out of a nightmare. From January 21st to the 23rd, the Nautilus hurtled through the ocean at breakneck speed, 250 leagues in a single day, or roughly 22 miles per hour. It was this incredible pace that brought us face to face with such diverse marine life, drawn to the electric beam like moths to a flame. Though most couldn't keep up, a few managed to hold their own in our wake for a time. On the morning of the 24th, we skirted the shores of Keeling Island, a coral atoll teeming with magnificent coconut palms. Darwin and Fitzroy had visited this remote paradise, and now our nets hauled up a bounty of polyps and mollusk shells. Captain Nemo added precious delphinuli to his collection, while I claimed an Astrea punctifera, a parasitic polyp clinging to a shell. Leaving Keeling Island behind, we turned northwest towards the Indian Peninsula. Our pace slowed, our course became more erratic, and we began utilizing the Nautilus's internal mechanisms to adjust our buoyancy and reach greater depths. Still, we never plumbed the true bottom of the Indian Ocean, rumored to exceed 7,000 fathoms. Even in those depths, the thermometer never dipped below 4 degrees Celsius, and I noted that the upper layers of water were consistently colder than the surface. On January 25th, the ocean lay deserted, a blank canvas upon which the Nautilus painted broad strokes with its powerful screw, churning the waves into towering plumes. To any observer, we must have resembled a gargantuan sea creature breaching the surface. I spent hours on deck that day, scanning the horizon, but nothing appeared until a steamer heading west crossed our path in the late afternoon. We were too low in the water to be seen, and she vanished as quickly as she'd appeared. As dusk settled, fleeting twilight that bridges day and night in the tropics, Conseil and I were treated to an extraordinary sight. A flotilla of hundreds of Argonauts drifting on the surface. These graceful cephalopods, unique to the Indian Ocean, propelled themselves backward using a jet of water, their 6 elongated tentacles trailing like streamers, while the remaining 2 served as sails. Their fluted, spiral shells, rightly compared by Cuvier to elegant skiffs, housed the creatures without being permanently attached. For nearly an hour, we glided through this mesmerizing assembly. Then, as if startled by an unseen signal, every Argonaut simultaneously retracted its sails, folded its arms, inverted its shell, and vanished beneath the waves. The synchronized maneuver rivaled the most disciplined naval fleet. Darkness fell swiftly, and the ocean calmed, leaving only the gentle rustling of reeds against the Nautilus's hull. The following day, we crossed the equator at the 82nd meridian, entering the northern hemisphere. A menacing escort of sharks shadowed us, their presence a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in these waters. There were blunt-nosed Isabella sharks with their distinctive spots, and the dreaded Castracion philippi, their 11 rows of teeth a chilling sight. These apex predators repeatedly lunged at the saloon windows, their impacts jolting us with unsettling force. Ned Land, never one to back down from a challenge, grew increasingly agitated. He longed to surface and harpoon the beasts, especially the mosaic-mouthed smooth hounds and the massive tiger sharks that seemed to particularly enrage him. But the Nautilus, accelerating effortlessly, outpaced even the swiftest among them. On the 27th, as we entered the vast Bay of Bengal, a grim scene unfolded. Countless corpses bobbing on the surface. They were victims of the Ganges, bodies swept out to sea, untouched by vultures, the only undertakers in these parts. Now the sharks would finish the macabre ritual. As evening approached, the ocean transformed into a sea of milk, the water glowing with an ethereal white luminescence. The moon, a mere sliver in the sky, couldn't be the cause. Even Conseil, with his encyclopedic knowledge, was baffled. It's called a milk sea, I explained, a phenomenon often seen near Amboina and in these waters. But what causes it, sir? Conseil inquired. The water hasn't actually turned into milk, has it? No, my boy, I chuckled. The glow comes from billions of tiny bioluminescent creatures, a type of infusoria. They're practically invisible, no bigger than a hair's width, and they cluster together for miles. Miles? Conseil exclaimed, his eyes wide with wonder. Don't even try to calculate their numbers, I advised. It's impossible. Ships have been known to sail through these milky seas for over 40 miles. Around midnight, the sea returned to its normal hue, but the ghostly glow lingered in the sky behind us, stretching to the horizon like a spectral aurora borealis. Chapter 2. A novel proposal from Captain Nemo. On February 28th, the Nautilus surfaced at noon in 9 degrees 4 hours N latitude. A rugged mountain range, its peaks jagged and imposing, rose from the landmass 8 miles to the west. Checking our bearings, I confirmed we were nearing Ceylon, that jewel of an island dangling from the tip of the Indian peninsula. Captain Nemo and his first officer materialized on deck. A quick glance at the map, and Nemo turned to me with a proposition. The island of Ceylon, renowned for its pearl fisheries. Care to visit one, Monsieur Aronnax? Absolutely, Captain, I replied, my curiosity piqued. Easy enough, Nemo said, though we'll see the fisheries, not the fishermen. The harvest hasn't begun yet. No matter, we'll set course for the Gulf of Mannar, arriving under cover of darkness. He barked a command to his officer, who promptly disappeared. The Nautilus dove, the depth gauge indicating 30 feet. You and your companions shall explore the Mannar pearl banks, Nemo continued, and if by chance any divers are present, we shall witness their craft. Sounds agreeable, Captain, I said, trying to match his nonchalance. By the way, Monsieur Aronnax, he added casually, you aren't afraid of sharks, are you? Sharks, I sputtered, the question catching me off guard. Nemo raised an eyebrow, awaiting my answer. I confess, Captain, I'm not well acquainted with that particular fish. We're quite familiar with them, he replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. You will be too, in time. Besides, we'll be armed, and perhaps we'll have the opportunity to bag a few along the way. Quite exhilarating, wouldn't you say? He sauntered off, leaving me to grapple with the implications of his invitation. Now, if someone offered you a bear hunt in the Swiss Alps, you'd likely jump at the chance. Or a lion hunt on the Atlas Plains, or a tiger in the Indian jungles. Adventure calls, and you'd answer. But a shark hunt in its own domain, that might give you pause. I wiped a cold sweat from my brow. Otter hunting in underwater forest was one thing, but venturing into the depths where sharks reign supreme was another matter entirely. I'd heard tales of Andaman Islanders fearlessly battling these predators with knives and nooses, but those tales rarely ended well for the hunters. I was no islander, and even if I were, a moment's hesitation seemed warranted. At that moment, Conseil and Ned Land entered. Oblivious to the conversation I'd just had, they were in high spirits, even giddy. Well, sir, Ned declared, your Captain Nemo, the devil take him, has just extended us a rather generous invitation. Ah, I said, playing along. So you've heard? If it pleases you, sir, Conseil interjected, the commander of the Nautilus has invited us to accompany you on an excursion to the famed Ceylon pearl fisheries tomorrow. He was most cordial, a true gentleman. He mentioned nothing else? I asked. Only that he'd already spoken to you about this little outing, Conseil replied. Sir, Conseil piped up again, eager for knowledge. Would you be so kind as to enlighten us on the subject of pearl diving? Would you like to know about the process itself, I asked, or the dangers involved? The process, Ned replied. Best to know what we're getting into before we get into it. Very well, I said. Take a seat, my friends, and I shall educate you. Ned and Conseil settled onto an ottoman, and the first question, as always, came from the Canadian. Sir, what exactly is a pearl? My dear Ned, I began. To a poet, a pearl is a tear of the sea. To the people of the East, it's a drop of solidified dew. To the ladies, it's an iridescent jewel to adorn their fingers, necks, and ears. To a chemist, it's a compound of calcium phosphate and carbonate, with a touch of gelatin. And to a naturalist, I concluded, it's simply an abnormal secretion from the organ that produces mother of pearl in certain bivalves. Bivalves, a type of mollusk, Conseil added helpfully. Precisely, my learned Conseil. And among these mollusks, the abalone, the giant clam, the turban snail, in short, any creature that produces mother of pearl, that shimmering substance lining their shells, can potentially create pearls. Even mussels, Ned asked. Yes, certain mussels found in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and parts of Europe. Good to know, Ned replied, nodding thoughtfully. I'll be keeping an eye out for those. But, I continued, the mollusk most renowned for producing pearls is the pearl oyster, Meleagrina margaritifera, that precious pink tartar. A pearl is nothing more than a nacreous growth, deposited in a spherical shape, either attached to the oyster's shell or embedded within its flesh. When attached to the shell, it's firmly anchored. Within the flesh, it's loose. But at its core, there's always a small, hard irritant, maybe a sterile egg, maybe a grain of sand, around which the pearly substance accumulates, layer by layer, over time. Do they find many pearls in a single oyster? Conseil inquired. Indeed they do, my boy. Some oysters are veritable treasure chests. There's even a tale, though I'm skeptical, of one oyster yielding 150. I paused, realizing my error. 150 sharks? Ned exclaimed, his eyes widening. Did I say sharks? I hastily corrected myself. I meant 150 pearls, of course. Sharks wouldn't make much sense. No, sir, Conseil agreed with a chuckle. But would you now tell us how they actually extract these pearls? There are different methods, I explained. If a pearl is attached to the shell, it can be pried off with pliers. But more often, they lay the oysters out on beds of seaweed to decompose in the open air. After about 10 days, they're soaked in large tanks of seawater, then opened and meticulously washed. The price of these pearls varies depending on size, Conseil inquired, his scientific mind always seeking patterns. Not only size, I replied, but also shape, colour and lustre, that captivating iridescent shimmer. The finest are called virgin pearls or paragons. They form within the oyster's tissue, often white, sometimes opaque, sometimes as translucent as opals. They're usually round or oval, the round ones becoming bracelets, the oval ones pendants. Since they're the most valuable, they're sold individually. Pearls attached to the shell are less uniform and sold by weight. And at the bottom of the hierarchy are tiny seed pearls, sold by the measure and primarily used for embellishing religious garments. But, Conseil pressed, is pearl diving dangerous? Not particularly, I answered, perhaps a bit too quickly. Especially if certain precautions are taken. What risks are there anyway? Ned Land scoffed, swallowing a few mouthfuls of seawater. Just as you say, Ned. I adopted Captain Nemo's nonchalant tone and added, speaking of which, are you afraid of sharks, my brave harpooner? Me? Ned retorted. Afraid of sharks? I laugh in the face of danger. Ah, I countered. But we're not talking about hunting them from a boat with a harpoon gun, hauling them aboard, slicing off their tails, and tossing their guts overboard. Ned paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Then, you're talking about... Exactly, I said, meeting his gaze. In the water. In the water. Well then, Ned declared, with a good harpoon, it's a fair fight. Those sharks are clumsy brutes. They have to roll onto their bellies to attack. And in that moment, Ned's dramatic description of a shark's attack sent a shiver down my spine. And you, Conseil, I turned to our steadfast companion. What are your thoughts on sharks? Me, sir, Conseil began. I'll be frank. That's best, I thought to myself. If you, sir, Conseil continued, intend to face these sharks, I see no reason why your loyal servant shouldn't face them alongside you. Chapter 3. A Pearl of 10 Millions. At 4 a.m, Nemo's steward woke me. I quickly dressed and entered the saloon, where the captain was already waiting. Monsieur Aronnax, Nemo said, are you ready for our expedition? Absolutely, I replied, eager to explore the pearl banks. Then follow me. What about Ned and Conseil? I asked. They've been notified and are waiting on deck, Nemo assured me. Aren't we going to wear our diving suits? I inquired, surprised. Not yet, Nemo explained. I haven't brought the Nautilus too close to shore. and the Manar Bank is still some distance away. Our dinghy will ferry us to the precise dive site, saving us a lengthy swim. It's carrying our gear, which we'll put on when we're ready to submerge. Nemo led me to the central companionway that led up to the deck. Ned and Conseil were already there, clearly excited about the pleasure party in store for them. 5 of the Nautilus's crewmen waited at the oars of the dinghy, which was secured to the side of the vessel. The night was moonless, a thick blanket of clouds obscuring all but a few stars. I looked towards the coast, barely visible as a dark line on the horizon. The Nautilus had spent the night cruising up Ceylon's western coast, and now we were positioned west of the gulf formed by the island and the mainland. Beneath the dark water lay the famed Manar Pearl Banks, a 20-mile stretch of underwater riches waiting to be plundered. We climbed into the dinghy's stern. The first mate took the helm, his crewmates poised at the oars. The line was cast off, and we slipped away from the Nautilus. The oarsmen maintained a steady rhythm, their strokes powerful but deliberate. I observed the 10-second interval between each pull, a naval technique designed for efficiency. The rhythmic plop of the oars echoed in the silence as droplets fell like molten lead onto the dark water. We rowed in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Nemo's expression was unreadable. Was he apprehensive about returning to land, so close yet so distant? Conseil, ever the curious observer, was no doubt buzzing with anticipation. And Ned, well, Ned was probably dreaming of harpooning a shark or two. As the first light of dawn tinged the eastern horizon, the coastline gradually emerged from the darkness. It appeared mostly flat, with a slight rise to the south. 5 miles still lay between us and land, the details obscured by a morning mist hanging low over the water. Then, with the suddenness characteristic of the tropics, day broke. The sun pierced the clouds, a blazing orb ascending rapidly into the sky. I could now clearly make out the shoreline, dotted with scattered trees. We approached Manar Island, its southern edge curving gently into the bay. Nemo rose from his seat, his eyes scanning the sea. With a subtle hand gesture, he ordered the anchor dropped. The chain barely extended. The water here was only a few feet deep, marking one of the highest points of the Pearl Banks. "Here we are, Monsieur Aronnax," Nemo announced. "See that sheltered bay? In a month's time, it will be packed with fishing vessels, their divers scouring these waters for treasure. Fortunately, this bay is well suited for pearl diving. The calm surface, protected from harsh winds, makes for ideal working conditions. Now let's suit up and begin our underwater exploration." I nodded silently, my eyes fixed on the waves as I donned my cumbersome diving suit with the help of the sailors. Nemo and my companions followed suit. None of the Nautilus crew would be joining us on this particular venture. Soon, we were encased in our rubberized suits, air tanks securely fastened to our backs. I'd asked about the Ruhmkorff lamps, but Nemo had dismissed the idea. "They won't be necessary," he'd explained. "We're not venturing very deep, and sunlight will provide ample illumination. Besides," he added with a cryptic smile, "it wouldn't be wise to attract unwanted attention with our electric lights in these waters." As Nemo spoke, I turned towards Conseil and Ned. They had already sealed their helmets, ready for the dive. I had one last question for the captain. "What about weapons?" I asked. "Our guns." "Guns? For what purpose?" Nemo retorted. "Do mountaineers hunt bears with rifles? Steel is far more dependable than lead. Here, take this sturdy blade. Clip it to your belt and let's get going." I looked at my companions. They were similarly armed, with Ned Land, predictably, brandishing the massive harpoon he'd brought from the Nautilus. Following Nemo's example, I donned the heavy copper helmet, and the hiss of oxygen filled my ears. One after the other, we plunged into the water, landing on a smooth, sandy bottom 6 feet below the surface. Nemo gestured, and we followed him down a gentle slope, descending deeper into the underwater world. Schools of tail-finned monoptera darted around us like startled birds. I recognized the Javanese fish, an eel-like creature over 2 feet long, its pale underside contrasting with shimmering gold stripes. Among the flat-bodied Stromatius, with their scythe-like dorsal fins, I saw a dazzling spectrum of colours. This was the carawady, a local delicacy when dried and preserved. Then there were the armoured trunquibars, their bodies encased in bony plates. As the sun climbed higher, its rays penetrated deeper into the water, illuminating the changing landscape. The sandy bottom transitioned to a rocky path, now carpeted with mollusks and coral. I spotted Platiinae, a type of Red Sea ostration with their distinctive uneven shells, and orange Lucinae with smooth, rounded ones. 3-foot-long rockfish lurked in crevices, their fins spread like grasping hands. Faintly glowing Panopyres drifted by, along with the majestic Oculini. Their fan-like structures are testament to the rich biodiversity of these waters. Clumsy crustaceans scurried among the vibrant flora, including triangular shelled Raninae and the monstrous-looking Parthenopes. Around 7 a.m, we finally reached the oyster beds, teeming with millions of pearl oysters. Nemo pointed towards the massive mounds of shells, a seemingly inexhaustible source of treasure. Nature's creative power, it seemed, far surpassed humanity's destructive tendencies. Ned, driven by his hunter's instinct, eagerly filled his net with prime specimens. But we couldn't linger. We had to follow Nemo, who navigated these underwater paths as if guided by an internal compass. The seafloor gradually ascended, and at times I could even raise my hand above the surface. Then the terrain would suddenly dip again. We rounded towering, pyramid-shaped rocks where giant crustaceans, perched atop their claws like alien war machines, watched us with unblinking eyes. Underfoot, all manner of annelids wriggled through the sand. Ahead, a large grotto opened before us, carved into a picturesque cluster of rocks and adorned with lush marine vegetation. At first, it seemed pitch black. The sunlight filtering through the water grew progressively dimmer until it was barely a ghostly luminescence. Nemo entered, and we followed. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I made out archways that sprang from natural pillars, like the massive columns of some ancient Tuscan temple. Why had our enigmatic guide brought us to this hidden chamber? The answer was soon revealed. We descended a steep incline, reaching the bottom of a circular pit. Nemo stopped, gesturing towards something I hadn't yet noticed. It was an enormous oyster, a gargantuan giant clam, a tridacna large enough to hold an entire lake of holy water. Its shell, more than 8 feet wide, dwarfed even the massive specimen displayed in the Nautilus's saloon. I approached this extraordinary mollusk. It clung to a granite table by its byssus threads, flourishing in the tranquil water of the grotto. I estimated its weight at 600 pounds. Such an oyster could yield 30 pounds of meat, a feast fit for a giant indeed. Captain Nemo was clearly familiar with this giant clam, and he had a specific purpose in examining it. The shells were slightly open. Nemo carefully wedged his dagger between them to prevent them from snapping shut, then gently lifted the fringed mantle that hid the creature inside. Nestled within the fleshy folds lay a pearl the size of a coconut. Its perfect sphere, flawless clarity, and radiant luster marked it as a jewel of unimaginable value. My curiosity piqued, I reached out to grasp it, but Nemo stopped me with a gesture. He quickly withdrew his dagger, and the shells slammed shut with a resounding clack. In that moment, I understood Nemo's intentions. By leaving this pearl undisturbed, he was allowing it to grow even larger. Every year, the oyster would add another layer of shimmering nacre. I estimated its worth at a staggering £500,000, at least. After 10 minutes, Nemo abruptly stopped. I assumed we were heading back, but he signaled for us to crouch beside him in a rocky crevice, pointing towards a figure emerging from the hazy depths. A shadow materialized about 15 feet away, then sank to the bottom. My mind conjured up images of sharks, but I was wrong again. This was no sea monster, but a man, a living, breathing Indian fisherman, a lone soul seeking an early harvest. The bottom of his canoe bobbed a few feet above him, tethered by a rope. A stone weight, shaped like a sugar loaf and clamped between his feet, helped him descend. This was his only diving gear. Upon reaching the bottom, about 15 feet down, he dropped to his knees and frantically filled his sack with oysters. Seemingly grabbing them at random, he surfaced, emptied the bag, hauled up the stone, and dove once more. The entire cycle took 30 seconds. The diver was unaware of our presence, hidden in the rock's shadow. How could this impoverished man imagine that others, beings like himself, were watching his every move, observing his desperate gamble with the sea? He continued his routine, never collecting more than 10 oysters per dive. Each one had to be wrenched from the seabed, where they clung tenaciously with their strong byssus threads. And who knew how many of these oysters, harvested at the risk of his life, contained no pearls at all? I became engrossed in his rhythmic movements, the repetitive dance of desperation and hope. Then, as the diver knelt on the seafloor, a chilling shriek pierced the silence. He sprang upwards in terror, kicking towards the surface. The source of his fear was instantly clear. A colossal shadow loomed above him, an enormous shark with cold, predatory eyes and gaping jaws. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to react. The monstrous creature lunged, the diver narrowly dodging its fins, but not its powerful tail, which slammed into his chest, sending him sprawling on the sandy bottom. The scene unfolded in a matter of seconds. The shark circled back, rolling onto its back to expose its belly and deliver a fatal bite. Then, in a flash of movement, Captain Nemo emerged from the darkness. Dagger in hand, he charged towards the predator, ready to engage in a life-or-death struggle. The shark, sensing a new adversary, turned to face this unexpected challenge. I watched in stunned silence as Nemo braced himself, his composure chilling in the face of imminent danger. As the massive shark rushed him, Nemo sidestepped with lightning speed, burying his dagger deep into the creature's flank. But the battle had only just begun. The wounded shark thrashed violently, the water turning crimson. Through the bloody haze, I could see nothing but flashes of movement as Nemo, clinging to a fin, fought with the enraged creature, landing blow after blow, but unable to deliver a decisive strike. The shark's violent struggle churned the water with such force that I feared being swept away. I desperately wanted to help Nemo, but I was frozen, a helpless observer to the underwater chaos. The captain was knocked to the seafloor by the sheer mass of the creature. The shark's jaws opened wide, resembling an industrial cutting tool, and I thought Nemo was finished. But in a flash, Ned Land reacted. Harpoon in hand, he charged the shark and drove the barbed point deep into its side. The water exploded in a crimson cloud as the shark thrashed in its death throes, its fury shaking the very sea around us. Ned's aim had been true. The beast was mortally wounded. It spasmed in gruesome convulsions, the shockwave knocking Conseil off his feet. Ned managed to free Nemo, who, miraculously unscathed, rushed to the injured diver. With a swift cut of his knife, he severed the rope that bound the man to his stone weight. Scooping him up, Nemo kicked powerfully towards the surface, carrying the unconscious diver in his arms. We followed seconds later, our own lives saved by a miracle, and clambered into the fisherman's canoe. Nemo's first priority was to revive the man. I doubted he would succeed. While the diver hadn't been underwater for long, the impact of the shark's tail could have been lethal. But to my astonishment, Nemo and Conseil's rapid CPR techniques worked. The diver's eyes fluttered open, his expression a mixture of terror and bewilderment as he gazed at the four of us in our copper diving helmets. His confusion only intensified when Nemo produced a pouch from his suit and placed it in the diver's trembling hand. The pouch was brimming with pearls, a lavish gift from the man of the depths to this poor Singhalese fisherman. The diver's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. He clearly understood that he owed his life and newfound fortune to beings beyond the realm of ordinary men. With a nod from Nemo, we swam back to the Nautilus, retracing our path along the ocean floor. Safely aboard, we shed our heavy helmets with the aid of the crew. Nemo's first words were for the Canadian. "Thank you, Master Land," he said simply. "It was payback, Captain," Ned replied. "I was simply returning the favor." A ghost of a smile crossed Nemo's lips, but he said nothing more. "Back to the Nautilus," he commanded. The dinghy raced across the waves. Moments later, we encountered the shark's lifeless body floating on the surface. By the distinctive black tips of its fins, I recognized it as the notorious Carchahinus melanopterus, the black-tip reef shark. It was over 25 feet long, its massive jaws taking up a third of its body. Its 6 rows of triangular teeth confirmed it was a fully grown adult. As I contemplated this behemoth's demise, a dozen more sharks appeared, swarming around the carcass and tearing at it in a feeding frenzy, oblivious to our presence. By 8:30 a.m., we were back aboard the Nautilus. I reflected on the day's extraordinary events at the Mannar Bank. 2 undeniable conclusions emerged. First, Captain Nemo possessed a courage I had never witnessed before. And second, despite his self-imposed exile from humanity, he still cared deeply for his fellow man. When I remarked on this to him, Nemo's voice wavered with emotion as he replied, "That Indian, sir, is a citizen of an oppressed nation, and I am still and shall always be one of them." Chapter 4, The Red Sea. On January 29th, the island of Ceylon vanished over the horizon as the Nautilus zipped through the maze of channels separating the Maldives from the Laccadives at 20 knots. We skirted Kiltan, a coral island discovered by Vasco da Gama back in 1499. We'd now travelled 16,220 miles, 7,500 leagues, since our journey began in the Japanese seas. The next day, we surfaced in the open ocean, no land in sight. Our course was set northeast towards the Sea of Oman, between the Arabian Peninsula and India. It was essentially a dead end. Where was Nemo taking us, I couldn't say. Ned Land, as usual, was not content with the unknown. He confronted me, demanding to know our destination. "Wherever the captain's whims take us, Master Ned," I replied. "His whims won't get us far," Ned grumbled. "The Persian Gulf is a cul-de-sac. We go in, we come right back out." "So we'll come back out then," I said. "And if, after the Persian Gulf, the Nautilus feels like visiting the Red Sea, the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb provide a convenient entrance." "The Red Sea's closed off too," Ned pointed out. "The Suez Canal isn't finished yet, and even if it were, a vessel like ours wouldn't risk navigating a canal with locks. Besides, the Red Sea isn't exactly on the way back to Europe." "But I never said we were heading back to Europe," I countered. "Then what's the plan?" Ned pressed. "I suspect that after exploring the fascinating coasts of Arabia and Egypt," I speculated, "the Nautilus will continue down the Indian Ocean, perhaps passing through the Mozambique Channel or past the Mascarene Islands, eventually reaching the Cape of Good Hope." "And once at the Cape of Good Hope," Ned asked, a note of urgency in his voice. "Well, then we'll venture into the uncharted Atlantic," I said. "My dear Ned, you seem weary of this underwater adventure, tired of the endless wonders of the sea. Personally, I'll be sad to see this voyage end. It's a journey few men have the privilege to undertake." 4 days until February 3rd, the Nautilus crisscrossed the Sea of Oman at varying speeds and depths. It seemed to move erratically, as if uncertain of its path, but we never crossed the Tropic of Cancer. As we left the Sea of Oman, we caught a fleeting glimpse of Muscat, one of the most important cities in Oman. Its white buildings and forts stood out starkly against the black cliffs that surrounded it. I glimpsed the rounded domes of its mosques, the elegant minarets, the lush green terraces, but it was just a fleeting vision as the Nautilus quickly dove beneath the waves. We coasted along the Arabian shores of Mahra and Hadramaut, a 6-mile stretch of undulating mountains punctuated by ancient ruins. On February 5th, we finally entered the Gulf of Aden, a narrow funnel leading to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the gateway to the Red Sea. The next day, the Nautilus surfaced near Aden, a city perched on a promontory connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus. Its fortifications, rebuilt by the British after their 1839 takeover, made it an impenetrable fortress, a Gibraltar of the East. I caught sight of the town's octagonal minarets, once a symbol of its status as a thriving commercial center. I assumed that Nemo, having reached this point, would turn back. But to my surprise, he didn't. On February 7th, we entered the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, its name translating to Gate of Tears in Arabic. Though only 20 miles wide, the strait stretched 32 miles long. For the Nautilus, at full speed, the crossing was a mere hour's work. Yet, I saw nothing. Not even Perim Island, where the British had fortified Aden's strategic position. The narrow passage was too congested, with English and French steamers plying the routes between Suez, Bombay, Calcutta, Melbourne, and the islands. For the Nautilus to risk surfacing, we remained prudently submerged. Around noon, we finally entered the waters of the Red Sea. I didn't bother questioning Nemo's sudden fascination with this particular body of water, but I couldn't deny my own approval. The Nautilus slowed its pace, sometimes surfacing, sometimes diving to avoid ships. This allowed me to observe both the surface and depths of this enigmatic sea. At dawn on February 8th, the ruined city of Mocha appeared, its crumbling walls barely standing, still sheltered a few date palms. Once a bustling metropolis with 6 markets and 26 mosques, its 2-mile perimeter had been fortified with 14 forts. The Nautilus then hugged the African coast, where the water was deeper. Through the observation windows, we witnessed a stunning underwater landscape of vibrant coral reefs and massive boulders draped in lush green algae. It was a breathtaking spectacle. The volcanic islands and sandbanks creating a kaleidoscope of colours and textures. But the most captivating sight was on the eastern shore, the coast of Tahama. There, the coral formations didn't just flourish below the surface, they also extended up to 60 feet above, creating intricate otherworldly structures less colourful than their submerged counterparts, yet equally mesmerising. I spent countless hours glued to the saloon windows, marvelling at the new species of marine flora and fauna revealed by our electric lamps. On February 9th, the Nautilus found itself in the widest part of the Red Sea, which spans 90 miles between Suakin on the western coast and Confida on the eastern. That afternoon, after taking our bearings, Captain Nemo joined me on the deck. I was determined to finally confront him about his plans. As soon as he saw me, he approached and graciously offered me a cigar. "Well, sir," he began, "are you enjoying the Red Sea? Have you had ample opportunity to observe its wonders? The fish, the coral, the sponges, the underwater forests, and have you caught a glimpse of the coastal towns?" "Indeed, Captain Nemo," I replied. "The Nautilus is perfectly suited for such exploration. It's a truly remarkable vessel." "Yes, sir, remarkable and impervious," Nemo agreed. "It fears neither the violent storms of the Red Sea nor its treacherous currents and sandbars." "Quite true," I said. "This sea has a reputation for being one of the most dangerous. If I'm not mistaken, the ancients regarded it with dread." "Detestable, you say?" Nemo mused. "Greek and Latin historians weren't fond of it. Strabo claimed it was extremely perilous during the Atassian winds and monsoon season. The Arab scholar Edrisi referred to it as the Gulf of Kulzum, describing ships lost to its sandbars and sailors afraid to venture out at night. He considered it a sea prone to devastating hurricanes, littered with inhospitable islands, offering nothing of value on its surface or in its depths. "Clearly," I replied, "those historians never had the pleasure of sailing aboard the Nautilus." "Exactly," Nemo said with a smile. "And in that regard, modern man isn't much more advanced than the ancients. It took centuries to harness the power of steam. Who knows, perhaps in another 100 years, we'll see a second Nautilus. Progress is slow, Monsieur Aronnax." "True," I conceded. "Your vessel is at least a century ahead of its time, maybe even an entire era. It's a shame that the secrets of such an invention should die with its creator." Nemo didn't respond. After a moment of silence, he continued, "You mentioned the ancient historian's concerns about the Red Sea's dangers. Yes, I confirmed. But weren't their fears exaggerated? Yes and no, Monsieur Aronnax, Nemo replied, his knowledge of the Red Sea encyclopedic. What poses no threat to a modern, well-equipped vessel with a powerful engine and precise navigation is a different story for the ships of antiquity. Imagine those early explorers venturing out in boats made of planks sewn together with palm fibers, corked with animal fat and coated in resin. They lacked even basic navigational tools, relying on guesswork to navigate currents they barely understood. Shipwrecks were inevitable, even commonplace. But today, with modern steamers plying the route between Suez and the South Seas, the Red Sea holds no terror, despite its contrary winds. Captains and passengers no longer offer sacrifices before embarking, nor do they return adorned in wreaths to give thanks to the gods. I agree, I said. It seems steam has extinguished any sense of gratitude in the hearts of sailors. But Captain, since you've clearly studied this sea extensively, could you enlighten me as to the origin of its name? There are several explanations, Monsieur Aronnax. Would you care to hear the opinion of a 14th century chronicler? I'm all ears, I replied. This imaginative writer claimed the sea was named for the parting of the Red Sea, when Pharaoh's army was swallowed by the waves at the command of Moses. A poetic interpretation, Captain, I said, but not entirely satisfying. I'm curious to hear your personal opinion. In my view, Nemo began, the name Red Sea is a translation of the Hebrew word Adam. The ancients likely gave it that name due to the unique color of its waters. But so far, I've seen nothing but clear colorless waves, I pointed out. That's true for now, Nemo said. But as we venture deeper into the Gulf, you'll witness this peculiar phenomenon. I recall seeing the entire Bay of Tor as red as blood. And you attribute this coloration to microscopic algae, I asked. Precisely, Nemo confirmed. So this isn't your first time traversing the Red Sea and the Nautilus? I inquired. No, it isn't, he replied cryptically. Since you mentioned the Israelites crossing and the Egyptian army's demise, have you ever encountered any underwater evidence of this historical event? No, and for a good reason, Nemo answered. And that reason is, I pressed. The location where Moses and his people crossed is now so choked with sand that even camels can barely wet their hooves there. As you can imagine, there wouldn't be enough water for the Nautilus to navigate. Where is this location exactly? I asked. Slightly north of the Suez Isthmus, Nemo replied, in what used to be a deep estuary when the Red Sea extended to the Salt Lakes. Whether the crossing was miraculous or not, the Israelites did cross there to reach the Promised Land, and Pharaoh's army did perish at that very spot. I believe that excavations in the sand would uncover a wealth of ancient Egyptian artifacts. That seems likely, I agreed. For the sake of archaeology, let's hope those excavations happen someday. Perhaps when new cities are established on the isthmus after the Suez Canal is completed. Though, of course, such a canal would be of little use to a vessel like the Nautilus. True, Nemo said, but it would benefit the entire world. The ancients understood the value of connecting the Red Sea and the Mediterranean for trade, but they never considered a direct canal. They used the Nile River as an intermediary. In fact, the canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea was likely begun by Sesostris, according to legend. We know for certain that in 615 BC, Necho II initiated construction of a freshwater canal across the Egyptian plain towards Arabia. It was wide enough for 2 triremes to pass abreast and took 4 days to traverse. Darius the Great continued the project, and Ptolemy II probably completed it. Strabo even witnessed it in operation, but the elevation change from Bubastis to the Red Sea was so minimal that it was only navigable for a few months each year. This canal served commercial purposes until the time of Antony, when it was abandoned and filled with sand. The Caliph Omar later restored it, but it was ultimately destroyed in 761 or or 762 AD by Caliph al-Mansur to cut off supplies to a rebel leader. During his Egyptian campaign, your General Bonaparte discovered traces of the canal in the Suez Desert. Caught by the tide, he nearly perished before reaching Hajaroth, the very place where Moses had encamped 3,000 years earlier. Well, Captain, I ventured, what the ancients dared not undertake, this connection between the two seas, which will drastically shorten the route from Cadiz to India, Monsieur Lesseps has achieved. Soon, he will have transformed Africa into an immense island. Yes, Monsieur Aronnax, Nemo said, a surprising admiration in his voice. You have every right to be proud of your countrymen. Such a man brings more honor to a nation than any military conqueror. He faced the same scorn and rejection as so many others, but he persevered, driven by an indomitable will. It's a shame that a project of such international importance, one that could have defined an entire reign, was ultimately realized by the determination of a single individual. All credit to Monsieur Lesseps. Indeed, all credit to this remarkable citizen, I echoed, taken aback by Nemo's unexpected praise. Unfortunately, he continued, I cannot take you through the Suez Canal, but the day after tomorrow, you'll be able to see the long jetty of Port Said as we enter the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, I exclaimed, astonishment evident in my voice. Yes, sir. Does that surprise you? What surprises me is the thought that we'll be there in a mere 2 days. Is that so? Nemo inquired with a hint of amusement. Yes, Captain, I replied, though by now I should have learned to expect the unexpected aboard your vessel. And what, precisely, is the cause of this surprise? Well, it's the astonishing speed you must intend to maintain. The Nautilus is to circumnavigate Africa, round the Cape of Good Hope, and reach the Mediterranean in 2 days. Who said anything about rounding the Cape of Good Hope, sir? Nemo challenged. Unless the Nautilus can travel on land and traverse the isthmus, I began, my voice trailing off as a realization dawned on me. Or under it, Monsieur Aronnax, Nemo finished my sentence. Under it? I repeated, incredulous. Indeed, Nemo replied calmly. Long ago, nature created beneath that narrow strip of land what man has now replicated on its surface. What? You mean there's a passage? I asked, growing increasingly astonished. Yes, a subterranean tunnel, Nemo explained. I've named it the Arabian Tunnel. It passes beneath Suez and emerges in the Gulf of Pelusium. But the isthmus is nothing but shifting sand, I protested. Only to a certain depth, Nemo countered. At 55 yards, there's a solid layer of bedrock. Did you stumble upon this passage by chance? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Chance and deduction, sir, Nemo replied, but more deduction than chance. The passage not only exists, but I've utilized it on numerous occasions. Without it, I wouldn't have dared venture into the supposedly impassable Red Sea today. I observed that the Red Sea and the Mediterranean share a number of identical fish species. Intrigued, I wondered if there might be a connection between the two bodies of water. If so, the subterranean current would have to flow from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, simply due to the difference in sea level. I captured a large number of fish near Suez, attached copper rings to their tails, and released them back into the sea. Months later, off the coast of Syria, I recaptured some of those fish, still bearing the rings. The connection was confirmed. I searched for it with the Nautilus, found it, and traversed it. And soon, sir, you too will have journeyed through my Arabian Tunnel. Chapter 5, The Arabian Tunnel. That evening, at 21 degrees 30 N latitude, the Nautilus surfaced, nearing the Arabian coast. I caught sight of Jeddah, a major trading hub linking Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and India. The low sun highlighted the city's white buildings, the ships docked at the quays, and the reed huts of the Bedouin settlements beyond the city walls. As darkness fell, Jeddah slipped from view, and the Nautilus submerged into the faintly glowing depths. On February 10th, we spotted several ships sailing windward. The The Nautilus dove again, but at noon, with the sea clear, it rose back to the surface. Ned, Conseil, and I settled onto the deck. The eastern coastline was barely visible, a faint smudge against the hazy sky. As we chatted idly, Ned suddenly pointed towards a spot in the distance. "See anything out there, Professor?" he asked. "Not yet, Ned," I replied, "but my eyes aren't as sharp as yours." "Look closer," Ned urged. "There, to starboard, about level with the beacon. See that thing moving?" I squinted, focusing on the spot he indicated. "Yes, I think I see something. A long, dark shape on the water." The shape grew larger, resolving into a massive, elongated form just a mile away. It appeared to be a giant sandbar marooned in the open sea, but it wasn't a sandbar. It was a colossal dugong. Ned's eyes gleamed with excitement at the sight of the massive sea creature. His hand instinctively tightened around his imaginary harpoon. I could practically see him itching to jump into the water and engage in a primal battle. At that moment, Captain Nemo emerged onto the deck. He took in the scene, understanding Ned's eagerness. "If you had a harpoon in your hand right now, Master Land," he said, addressing the Canadian, "wouldn't it be burning a hole in your palm?" "You read my mind, Captain," Ned replied. "And wouldn't you relish the chance to return to your old profession, just for a day, and add this magnificent creature to your list of conquests?" Nemo asked. "Without a doubt, sir," Ned answered, his eyes blazing with anticipation. "Then you have my permission to try," Nemo declared. "Thank you, Captain," Ned exclaimed, barely able to contain his excitement. "Just one piece of advice, Master Land," Nemo added. "For your own sake, don't miss." "Are dugongs dangerous?" I inquired, despite Ned's dismissive shrug. "Yes, quite," Nemo replied. "They've been known to attack their pursuers, even capsizing boats. But I have no doubt Master Land can handle the risk." His aim is true, his arm steady. 7 of the Nautilus's crewmen, silent and stoic as always, appeared on deck. One carried a harpoon and a line similar to those used for whale hunting. The dinghy was lowered into the water. 6 men took their places at the oars, the coxswain at the helm. Ned, Conseil, and I climbed aboard. "You're not joining us, Captain?" I asked. "No, sir," Nemo replied, "but I wish you good hunting." The dinghy shot towards the dugong, which floated lazily about 2 miles from the Nautilus. As we closed the distance, the oarsmen slowed their pace, dipping their oars silently into the calm water. Ned, harpoon poised, stood at the bow. The harpoon used for whales is typically attached to a very long line that spools out rapidly as the wounded animal flees. But this line was only about 30 feet long, its end connected to a small floating barrel that would mark the dugong's underwater path. I watched as Ned prepared to take on the Canadian's quarry. This dugong, also known as a sea cow, resembled a manatee with a long cylindrical body tapering to a broad tail and flipper-like forelimbs. But unlike the gentle manatee, this dugong's upper jaw sported 2 long pointed tusks. The specimen Ned intended to hunt was colossal, easily over 20 feet long. It lay motionless, seemingly asleep on the surface, presenting an easy target. The dinghy closed in, the oarsmen resting on their oars just 20 feet away. Ned, tensed and focused, raised his harpoon, its tip gleaming in the sunlight. Suddenly, a hissing sound erupted from the water as the dugong vanished beneath the waves. Ned's harpoon, though thrown with expert force, struck nothing but empty water. "Damn it," Ned cursed, his frustration palpable. "I missed." "No, you didn't," I said, pointing. "Look, there's blood. You wounded it, but the harpoon didn't lodge in its flesh." "My harpoon! My harpoon!" Ned shouted, desperation edging his voice. The crew rowed towards the floating barrel, quickly retrieving the weapon. Then the chase began. The dugong periodically surfaced to breathe, its wound not hindering its powerful movements. The dinghy, propelled by the crew's strong arms, raced in pursuit. Ned readied his harpoon again and again, but the dugong always managed to evade him with a sudden dive. Ned's impatience grew with each failed attempt. his curses echoing across the water. I shared his frustration, eager to witness the capture of this magnificent creature. For an hour, the chase continued. I began to doubt we'd ever catch the dugong, when suddenly, in a fit of rage, the creature turned on the dinghy, becoming the aggressor. "Brace yourselves," Ned yelled. The coxswain shouted a warning to the crew in his native tongue. The dugong surged towards us, stopping just a few yards away to sniff the air with its large nostrils. Then, with a tremendous leap, it launched itself at the boat. The dinghy lurched violently, nearly capsizing and taking on a massive amount of water. Thanks to the coxswain's quick thinking, we were struck from the side rather than head-on, preventing a complete rollover. While Ned battled the beast at the bow, the dugong's tusks sank into the gunwale, lifting the entire boat out of the water like a lion with its prey. We were thrown into a chaotic pile, and I feared the worst. But Ned, fueled by adrenaline and fury, drove his harpoon deep into the dugong's heart. I heard the sickening crunch of teeth on metal as the creature vanished beneath the waves, taking the harpoon with it. But the barrel soon bobbed to the surface, followed shortly by the dugong's lifeless form, belly up. The crew secured the carcass and towed it back to the Nautilus. It took immense effort to hoist the 10,000-pound behemoth onto the deck. The next morning, February 11th, the Nautilus's larder was replenished with a more delicate catch. A flock of Egyptian sea swallows, Sterna niloticus, had landed on the ship. These elegant birds, with their black beaks, grey heads, and white bellies, were known for their delicious flavour. We also added a dozen Nile ducks to our stores, their distinctive black-spotted white heads promising another gourmet meal. Around 5 p.m, the Cape of Ras Mohammed came into view to the north. This cape marked the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, nestled between the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. The Nautilus entered the Straits of Jubal, leading to the Gulf of Suez. I could clearly see Mount Horeb, the towering peak where, according to the Bible, Moses had encountered God. By 6 p.m, the Nautilus, alternating between surfacing and diving to avoid other vessels, passed near the town of Tor at the mouth of the bay. As Nemo had predicted, the water here appeared tinged with red. Night fell, bringing with it a profound silence, broken only by the calls of pelicans and other nocturnal birds, the rhythmic crashing of waves against the shore, and the distant thrum of a steamer's engines churning through the Gulf. From 8 p.m. to 9 p.m, we remained submerged, cruising at a depth of several fathoms. Based on my calculations, we must have been close to Suez. Through the saloon windows, I watched the seabed illuminated by our electric lights. The strait seemed to narrow around us. At 9:15, the Nautilus surfaced, and I eagerly climbed to the deck, impatient to experience Nemo's tunnel. In the distance, I saw a pale light, partially obscured by the mist. "A lighthouse?" I asked. "The floating light of Suez," Nemo replied, appearing at my side. "We'll reach the tunnel entrance shortly." "Is the entrance difficult to navigate?" I inquired. "Indeed," Nemo said. "That's why I personally take the helm during the passage. If you'll excuse me, Monsieur Aronnax, the Nautilus is about to dive. We won't surface again until we've cleared the Arabian Tunnel." Nemo led me towards the central companionway. Halfway down, he opened a door and crossed the upper deck, arriving at the pilot's cabin, a compact 6 by 6 foot space resembling the helm of a Mississippi or Hudson River steamboat. A vertical wheel connected to the Nautilus's rudder dominated the room. 4 portholes with thick glass lenses offered a panoramic view. The cabin was dark, but my eyes soon adjusted. I could see the helmsman, a burly figure gripping the wheel's spokes. Outside, the powerful beacon mounted on the stern bathed the sea in an eerie glow. "Now," Nemo declared, "let's attempt this passage." Electrical wires linked the pilot's cabin to the engine room, allowing Nemo to control both the Nautilus's speed and direction. He pressed a button, and the propeller's rotation slowed. Through a porthole, I watched the sheer wall of rock and sand that bordered the narrow channel. For an hour, we followed it closely, just a few yards away. Nemo's eyes never left the compass, his hand hovering over the controls. With subtle adjustments, he guided the Nautilus through the winding passage. Peering through the porthole, I saw magnificent coral formations, swaying kelp forests, and strange zoophytes waving their enormous claws from cracks in the rock. At 10:15, Nemo took the helm himself. A wide, dark tunnel opened before us. The Nautilus surged into it, a deafening roar echoing through the hull. It was the rush of the Red Sea, the tunnel's incline forcing the water to surge violently towards the Mediterranean. We were swept along with the current, moving with the speed of an arrow, despite the reverse thrust of the propellers, fighting to slow our descent. In the electric glare, the tunnel walls blurred into streaks of light. My heart pounded in my chest. At 10:35, Nemo relinquished the helm and turned to me, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "The Mediterranean," he declared. In less than 20 minutes, propelled by the raging current, the Nautilus had traversed the Isthmus of Suez. Chapter 6. The Grecian Archipelago. The following day, February 12th, the Nautilus surfaced at dawn. I hurried to the deck and saw the faint outline of Pelusium, 3 miles to the south. A powerful current had swept us from one sea to another. Around 7 a.m., Ned and Conseil joined me, both looking refreshed. "Well, Professor," Ned greeted me, a playful tone in his voice. "What about the Mediterranean?" "We're floating on it right now, my friend," I replied. "What?" Conseil exclaimed. "Just like that?" "Indeed," I confirmed. "In a matter of minutes, we traversed that supposedly impassable isthmus." "I don't believe it," Ned said, his skepticism clear. "Then you're mistaken, Master Land," I chuckled. "That low coastline curving southward is the Egyptian coast, and you, with your keen eyesight, should be able to spot the Port Said jetty jutting into the sea." Ned studied the horizon, then a slow grin spread across his face. "You're absolutely right, Professor, and your captain is a bloody genius. We're in the Mediterranean. Now," he lowered his voice, "if you don't mind, let's have a private chat about our own situation." I understood what Ned was after. It was best to let him speak his mind, so we retreated to a quieter spot near the beacon, away from the spray of the waves. "All right, Ned," I said. "We're listening. What's on your mind?" "It's simple," Ned began. "We're in Europe now. Before Captain Nemo's whims drag us back to the polar ice caps or off to the Pacific, I'd like to request our departure from the Nautilus." I had no desire to restrict my companion's freedom, but the thought of leaving Nemo filled me with regret. Thanks to him and his incredible vessel, I was making daily progress in my underwater research. I was rewriting my book on the ocean depths in situ, so to speak. Would I ever have such an opportunity again? Unlikely. The thought of abandoning the Nautilus before my studies were complete was unbearable. "Ned, my friend," I asked, "be honest with me. Have you grown tired of life aboard the Nautilus? Do you regret the twist of fate that brought us into Captain Nemo's hands?" Ned paused, his arms folded across his chest. "Frankly, I don't regret this underwater journey," he admitted. "I'll be glad to have experienced it, but now that we've had our adventure, it's time to move on. That's my thinking anyway." "It will end eventually, Ned," I reassured him. "Where and when?" he pressed. "I don't know where," I confessed, "and I can't say when. Or rather, I suppose it will end when these seas have nothing more to teach us." "And what exactly are you hoping for?" Ned challenged. "That circumstances will arise, whether it's 6 months from now or sooner, that will allow us, even compel us, to leave." "Oh?" Ned retorted skeptically. "And where do you think we'll be in 6 months, Professor?" "Perhaps in China," I suggested. "The Nautilus is remarkably fast. It moves through water like a swallow through the air, or an express train on land. It doesn't shy away from well-travelled seas. Who's to say we won't find ourselves off the coasts of France, England, or even America, where escape might be more feasible?" "Professor," Ned said, shaking his head, "your arguments are flawed. You speak of the future. We'll be there. We'll be here. But I'm talking about the present. We are here, and we need to seize this opportunity. Ned's logic was hard to refute, and I found myself at a loss for a counter-argument. Professor, Ned continued, let's consider an impossibility. If Captain Nemo were to offer you your freedom today, would you accept it? I don't know, I admitted, torn between my thirst for knowledge and my longing for home. And if, Ned pressed, this offer was never to be repeated, would you take it then? My friend, I said, here's my answer. Your reasoning is sound. We can't rely on Nemo's goodwill. Common sense tells us he won't release us willingly. On the other hand, common sense also dictates that we seize the first opportunity to escape. Now you're talking, Monsieur Aronnax, Ned said, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. But there's a caveat, I warned. The opportunity must be perfect, and our first attempt must succeed. Failure would be catastrophic, and Nemo would never forgive us. True enough, Ned acknowledged. But that applies to any escape attempt, whether in 2 years or 2 days. The bottom line is this. If a favorable opportunity arises, we have to take it. Agreed, I said. Now, Ned, tell me, what exactly constitutes a favorable opportunity in your mind? A dark night, he replied, when the Nautilus is close to a European coast, and you try to swim for it, I asked. Yes, if we were near enough to shore and the Nautilus was surfaced, not if we were far out at sea or submerged. And if those conditions aren't met, then I take control of the dinghy. I know how to operate it. We'd sneak aboard, release the clamps, and surface without the pilot even noticing we're gone. All right, Ned, I said. Keep your eyes peeled for the right moment, but remember, one misstep and we're doomed. I won't forget, sir, Ned assured me. Now, Ned, I asked, would you like to hear my thoughts on your plan? Of course, Professor, he replied. Well, I believe, and I'm not saying I hope for this, that the opportunity you're envisioning may never present itself. Why not? Ned asked, his brow furrowing. Because Captain Nemo isn't foolish, I explained. He knows we haven't given up on freedom, and he'll be extra vigilant in these well-traveled waters, especially near the European coast. We'll see about that, Ned muttered, shaking his head stubbornly. For now, let's drop the subject, I suggested. The day you're ready, let us know, and we'll follow your lead. I trust you implicitly. This conversation would have grave consequences in the near future, but for now, it seemed my prediction was accurate, much to Ned's dismay. Was Nemo wary of us in these busy seas, or was he simply trying to avoid the countless vessels from all nations that crisscrossed the Mediterranean? I couldn't be sure. We spent most of our time submerged, far from shore. Even when the Nautilus surfaced, the pilot's cabin was the only part visible. Sometimes, we dove to astonishing depths. Between the Greek archipelago and Asia Minor, the seabed was over 6,000 feet below us. My only indication that we were near the island of Carpathos, one of the Sporades, was when Nemo recited lines from Virgil, pointing to a spot on the map. Est Carpathio Neptuni Gorgite Vates, Ceruleus Proteus. It was, indeed, the mythical home of Proteus, the prophetic old shepherd of Neptune's flocks. Now known as Scarpanto, the island lay nestled between Rhodes and Crete, but all I saw through the saloon windows was the granite bedrock far below. On February 14th, I planned to spend the day studying the fish of the Aegean Sea, but for some reason, the observation panels remained sealed shut. I checked the Nautilus's course and realized we were headed towards Crete, the ancient island of Minos. I had no idea what had become of the Cretan uprising against the Ottoman Empire that had been raging when I'd embarked on the Abraham Lincoln. Captain Nemo, cut off from all news of the outside world, couldn't enlighten me. I didn't mention the Cretan rebellion when I found myself alone with Nemo that night in the saloon. He seemed unusually quiet and preoccupied. Then, breaking his usual habit, he ordered both observation panels opened and moved between them, intently studying the water. I couldn't fathom his purpose, so I occupied myself by identifying the fish passing by. Suddenly, a figure materialized in the water, a diver, a leather pouch belted to his waist. This wasn't a corpse adrift at sea. It was a living man, swimming strongly, occasionally breaking the surface for air. "A shipwrecked sailor!" I exclaimed, turning to Nemo. "We have to rescue him!" Nemo didn't reply, but came to stand beside me, peering out the window. The diver approached, his face pressed against the glass, staring in at us. To my utter astonishment, Nemo signaled to him. The diver responded in kind, then immediately ascended to the surface and disappeared. "Don't worry," Nemo said calmly. "That's Nicholas of Cape Matapan, also known as Pesca. He's quite a legend in the Cyclades. A fearless diver, water is his natural habitat. He practically lives in it, island hopping as far as Crete." "You know him, Captain?" I asked, surprised. "Why wouldn't I, Monsieur Aronnax?" Nemo replied enigmatically. He walked over to a piece of furniture near the saloon's left panel. Beside it was an iron-bound chest with a copper plate bearing the Nautilus emblem. Nemo, seemingly oblivious to my presence, opened the chest. It was filled with gold bars. I was stunned. Where had this fortune come from? How had Nemo acquired it? And what did he intend to do with it? I kept silent and watched as Nemo methodically arranged the bars, filling the chest completely. I estimated the contents at over 4,000 pounds of gold, roughly 200,000 pounds sterling. Once the chest was secured, Nemo etched an address on the lid in what appeared to be modern Greek script. He then pressed a button, activating a communication link to the crew's quarters. 4 men arrived, and with some effort, hauled the heavy chest out of the saloon. I heard them hoisting it up the iron staircase using a system of pulleys. Nemo finally turned to me. "You were saying, sir?" he inquired. "Nothing, Captain," I replied, my mind racing. "Then if you'll excuse me, I bid you good night," Nemo said, departing the saloon. I returned to my cabin, deeply unsettled. I tried in vain to sleep, my thoughts consumed by the diver's appearance and the chest full of gold. What was the connection? Soon, I felt the familiar motion of the Nautilus ascending. Footsteps echoed on the deck above, followed by the sound of the dinghy being unmoored and lowered into the water. It bumped against the Nautilus's hull for a moment, then all was silent again. 2 hours later, the sounds repeated. The dinghy was hoisted back on board and secured, and the Nautilus submerged once more. So the gold had been delivered. But to where? And who was Nemo's contact? The following day, I relayed the night's events to Conseil and Ned, who were equally intrigued. "But where does he take all those millions?" Ned wondered aloud, his voice laced with suspicion. To that question, there was no answer. I returned to the saloon after breakfast and immersed myself in my work, organizing my notes until 5 in the evening. Suddenly, a wave of intense heat washed over me, forcing me to remove my coat. It was odd, considering our southerly latitude and the fact that the submerged Nautilus should maintain a stable temperature. I checked the depth gauge, 60 feet. There was no way surface heat could penetrate that far. The temperature continued to rise, becoming unbearable. Could there be a fire on board? I wondered aloud. Just then, Captain Nemo entered the saloon. He glanced at the thermometer and turned to me. 42 degrees Celsius, he stated. "I've noticed, Captain," I replied. "If it gets any hotter, we won't be able to stand it." "It will only get hotter if we choose to remain here," Nemo said cryptically. "You can control the temperature then?" "Not exactly," he said, "but I can move us away from the heat source." "So it's coming from outside?" "Indeed, we are currently drifting in a stream of superheated water." "Impossible," I exclaimed. "See for yourself." The observation panel slid open, revealing a scene that defied belief. The sea glowed an eerie white, and plumes of sulphurous smoke rose from the churning waves. I instinctively touched the glass, but the intense heat forced me to quickly retract my hand. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Near Santorini," Nemo replied. "I wanted to show you the fascinating phenomenon of an underwater volcanic eruption." "I thought the formation of new islands in this region had ceased," I said. "Nothing ever ceases in the volcanic regions of the sea," Nemo countered. "The Earth is constantly being reshaped by subterranean forces. In the year 19 AD, according to Cassiodorus and Pliny, a new island called Theia emerged in this very spot, only to vanish beneath the waves. It reappeared in 69 AD and then submerged again. Since then, until recently, the subterranean activity had been dormant. But on February 3rd, 1866, a new island, named George Island, rose from the sulfurous vapors near Nea Kamenni, only to sink again 6 days later. A week after that, on February 13th, the island of Aphroessa appeared, creating a narrow channel between itself and Nea Kamenni. I was in these waters when it happened, so I witnessed the entire process. Aphroessa, roughly circular in shape, measured 300 feet across and 30 feet high. It consisted of black, glassy lava mixed with feldspar fragments. And finally, on March 10th, a smaller island named Reka emerged near Nea Kamenni. These three have since merged into a single landmass. "And the channel we're in now?" I asked. Nemo showed me a map of the archipelago. "I've marked the new islands here," he said. I returned to the observation window. The Nautilus had stopped moving, and the heat was becoming unbearable. The once white sea now glowed crimson, tinted by iron salts. Despite the ship's airtight seals, a suffocating, sulfurous stench filled the saloon, and the electric lights flickered, their brilliance dimmed by the encroaching darkness. I felt like I was trapped in a sauna, my skin burning, my lungs struggling for air. "We can't stay in this boiling water any longer, Captain," I pleaded. "Indeed," Nemo agreed, his composure unwavering. "It would be unwise." He gave the order, and the Nautilus turned and fled the volcanic inferno. 15 minutes later, we were back on the surface, breathing in the cool night air. It struck me then that if Ned had chosen this moment for our escape, we would have perished in a fiery sea. The following day, February 16th, we left the basin between Rhodes and Alexandria, known to be over 9,000 feet deep. The Nautilus skirted the island of Kythera and exited the Grecian archipelago, having rounded Cape Matapan. Chapter 7. The Mediterranean in 48 hours. The Mediterranean, the quintessential blue sea, the great sea of the Hebrews, the sea of the Greeks, the mare nostrum of the Romans, a landscape of orange groves, aloes, cacti and pines, perfumed with myrtle, ringed by rugged mountains, and bathed in pure, crystalline air. Yet beneath its idyllic surface, the restless forces of Neptune and Pluto continue their ancient struggle for dominance. As Michelet observed, these shores and waters, blessed with one of the planet's most invigorating climates, have the power to rejuvenate the human spirit. But as beautiful as it was, I could only steal fleeting glances at this immense basin, 2 million square miles in area, as we raced across it. Even Captain Nemo's vast knowledge remained hidden from me, as the enigmatic man was conspicuously absent during our high-speed transit. I estimated we covered around 600 leagues, nearly 2,000 miles, in a mere 48 hours. Departing from the Greek coast on the morning of February 16th, we crossed the Strait of Gibraltar by sunrise on the 18th. It was clear to me that Nemo found this enclosed sea, surrounded by the very countries he sought to avoid, distasteful. Perhaps the waves and the breeze stirred up too many memories, too many regrets. Here, he lacked the freedom and independence he enjoyed on the open ocean. His Nautilus feeling confined between the shores of Africa and Europe. We now raced along at 25 miles per hour. Ned Land, to his great frustration, was forced to abandon his escape plan. Launching the dinghy at that speed would be like jumping from a moving train, foolhardy to say the least. Besides, the Nautilus only surfaced at night to replenish its air supply, navigating solely by compass and log. My view of the Mediterranean was limited to what a passenger on a high-speed train might glimpse. The distant horizon, with no time to register the details that flashed by. We passed between Sicily and the Tunisian coast. In the narrow stretch between Cape Bon and the Strait of Messina, the seabed rose abruptly, forming a submerged ridge with only 54 feet of water above it, while the surrounding depths reached 540 feet. The Nautilus had to maneuver carefully to avoid this underwater obstacle. I pointed out the reef's location on a map of the Mediterranean to Conseil. "It's like an underwater bridge connecting Europe to Africa," he observed. "Exactly," I replied. "It forms a natural barrier at the Strait of Sicily. Soundings by Smith have confirmed that in prehistoric times, the two continents were linked between Cape Bayeux and Cape Fiorina." "I can believe it," Conseil mused. "There's a similar ridge between Gibraltar and Ceuta," I added. "It once formed a dam across the entire Mediterranean. What if volcanic activity were to raise those two ridges above the waves?" Conseil pondered. "Not likely," I said. "But just imagine," Conseil persisted. "If that were to happen, it would certainly complicate matters for Monsieur Lesseps and his efforts to dig through the isthmus." "I agree," I said. "But I assure you, Conseil, such an event is improbable. The Earth's internal forces are gradually diminishing. Volcanoes, once abundant, are slowly dying out. The planet's core is cooling, its internal temperature dropping measurably every century. And that's detrimental, because the Earth's heat is its lifeblood." "But what about the sun?" Conseil asked. "The sun isn't enough," I explained. "It can't warm a lifeless body, can it?" "Not to my knowledge," he admitted. "Well, my friend, one day this Earth will be a cold corpse, as uninhabitable and desolate as the moon, which has long since lost its internal heat." "How many centuries until then?" Conseil wondered. "Hundreds of thousands of years, my boy," I replied. "Then we have plenty of time to finish our journey," Conseil said, relieved, "unless Ned Land interferes." He returned to studying the seafloor map as the Nautilus continued its course along the underwater ridge. On the night of February 16th, we entered the western basin of the Mediterranean, its deepest point reaching 8,700 feet. The Nautilus, manipulated by its expert crew, glided down the continental slope, disappearing into the abyssal depths. By 3 a.m. on February 18th, we'd reached the entrance to the Strait of Gibraltar. Here, two opposing currents met. The well-known surface current carrying ocean water into the Mediterranean, and a lesser-known, deeper countercurrent flowing in the opposite direction. This countercurrent is a necessity, for the Mediterranean's water level would rise annually due to the inflow from the Atlantic and various rivers. If not for this outflow through the strait, the Nautilus took advantage of this countercurrent, swiftly navigating the narrow passage. For a fleeting moment, I glimpsed the magnificent ruins of the Temple of Hercules, submerged beneath the waves, before we emerged into the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Chapter 8, Vigo Bay, the Atlantic, a vast expanse of water, 25 million square miles, stretching 9,000 miles in length and averaging 2,700 miles wide. Its meandering shores embraced a massive circumference, fed by the world's mightiest rivers: the St. Lawrence, the Mississippi, the Amazon, the Plata, the Orinoco, the Niger, the Senegal, the Elbe, the Loire, and the Rhine, carrying the waters of countless civilizations, both advanced and primitive. This magnificent arena, perpetually crisscrossed by vessels flying the flags of every nation, ended in those two formidable capes dreaded by all sailors, the Horn and the Cape of Storms. The Nautilus, having already travelled nearly 10,000 leagues in 3.5 months, a distance greater than the Earth's circumference, now pierced the Atlantic's waves with its steel prow. Where were we headed next? What did the future hold? Upon leaving the Strait of Gibraltar, the Nautilus had ventured far out into the open ocean. Now it returned to the surface, and our daily walks on deck resumed. I eagerly ascended, accompanied by Ned and Conseil. In the distance, about 12 miles away, the hazy outline of Cape St. Vincent marked the southwestern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. A strong southerly gale whipped the sea into a frenzy. causing the Nautilus to pitch violently. It was nearly impossible to keep our footing on the rain-slicked deck. After a few gasps of fresh air, we retreated below. I returned to my quarters, Conseil to his cabin, but the brooding Canadian followed me. Our rapid transit through the Mediterranean had thwarted his escape plan, and his disappointment was palpable. Once the door to my room was closed, he sat down, fixing me with a sullen stare. "Ned, my friend," I began, "I understand your frustration, but you can't blame yourself. Attempting to leave the Nautilus under those conditions would have been suicide." Ned remained silent, his jaw clenched, his brow furrowed. The obsession with escape had clearly taken root in his mind. "Let's not lose hope," I continued. "We're heading up the coast of Portugal. France and England aren't far, and they could offer us refuge. If the Nautilus had turned south after Gibraltar, sailing towards the open ocean, I'd share your unease. But we now know that Captain Nemo doesn't avoid civilization. In a few days, I believe you'll have a safe opportunity." Ned's eyes locked onto mine. Finally, he spoke. "Tonight's the night," he declared. I was startled, unprepared for this sudden announcement. I wanted to respond, but words failed me. "We agreed to wait for the right opportunity," Ned continued, "and that opportunity has arrived. Tonight will be mere miles from the Spanish coast. The sky is overcast. The wind is strong. You gave me your word, Professor, and I'm counting on you." Seeing my hesitation, Ned stepped closer. "Tonight, at 9 o'clock, I've informed Conseil. Nemo will be in his quarters, likely asleep. The crew won't see us. Conseil and I will head for the central companionway. You, Professor, stay in the library close by, awaiting my signal. The dinghy is stocked with oars, mast, sail, and even some provisions. I've even managed to acquire a wrench to remove the bolts securing the dinghy to the Nautilus. Everything is in place. All we need is tonight. The sea is rough," I cautioned. "I know," Ned acknowledged. "But we have to take that risk. Freedom is worth it. Besides, the dinghy is sturdy, and a few miles with a decent wind isn't much. Who knows, by tomorrow, we could be 100 leagues away. If luck is on our side, we'll be on solid ground by 10 or 11 tonight, dead or alive. But for now, I'll see you tonight." With that, he left, leaving me speechless. I had assumed that with the previous opportunity lost, we'd have time to discuss and reconsider. But my headstrong companion had given me no such luxury. And what could I have said to dissuade him? He was right. This was our chance. Could I break my promise and jeopardize the future of my companions? Tomorrow, Nemo could whisk us away to some remote corner of the globe. Just then, a loud hissing sound signaled that the Nautilus's ballast tanks were filling, and we were diving beneath the Atlantic waves. I spent the rest of the day in turmoil, torn between the desire for freedom and the reluctance to abandon the Nautilus and my unfinished research. Hours crawled by, my mind oscillating between visions of our successful escape and a desperate hope that something would prevent Ned's plan from unfolding. Twice, I went to the saloon, hoping to check our course on the compass and gauge our proximity to the coast. But the Nautilus remained in Portuguese waters. I had to make a decision, prepare for the escape. My belongings were few, my research notes, nothing more. As for Captain Nemo, I wondered what he'd make of our escape, what troubles it might cause him, and how he'd react if it failed. I couldn't fault his hospitality. In fact, I'd never known a more generous host. Leaving him wouldn't be an act of ingratitude, as no oath bound us to him. He was relying on circumstance, not our word, to keep us here. I hadn't seen Nemo since our encounter with the Santorini volcano. Would chance bring me face to face with him before our departure? I both desired and dreaded such an encounter. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of him in the adjoining room. But there was nothing. An unbearable tension gripped me. This day of waiting felt endless. My dinner arrived as usual, but I could barely eat, too preoccupied with the upcoming escape. I left the table at 7 p.m, with 120 agonizing minutes left before I was to meet Ned. My nerves frayed, my pulse quickened. I couldn't sit still. pacing back and forth, trying to calm my agitated mind. The fear of failure was almost a secondary concern. What truly terrified me was the prospect of our plan being discovered before we could leave the Nautilus, of being brought before a furious or, worse, disappointed Captain Nemo. I felt a need to see the saloon one last time. I descended the stairs and entered the museum, where I'd spent so many enjoyable and productive hours. I surveyed the treasures within, feeling like a man on the eve of eternal exile. I was about to leave all this behind. The natural wonders, the masterpieces of art that had become such a part of my life. I longed to take one last look at the Atlantic through the saloon windows, but the panels were sealed, a wall of steel separating me from the unexplored ocean beyond. Passing through the saloon, I approached the door leading to Nemo's quarters. To my surprise, it was slightly ajar. I hesitated, knowing he could see me if he was inside, but no sound reached my ears. The room was empty. I cautiously pushed the door open and stepped inside. The same stark, almost monastic austerity greeted me. Suddenly, the clock chimed 8 times. The sound jolted me from my reverie. I felt as though an invisible eye had peered into my innermost thoughts. I hastily retreated from the room. My gaze fell upon the compass. We were still heading north. The log indicated a moderate speed, the depth gauge showing about 60 feet. I returned to my cabin and dressed warmly in my sea boots, otterskin cap, and sealskin-lined coat. I was ready. I waited. The only sound the rhythmic thrum of the Nautilus's propeller. I listened intently, dreading the announcement that Ned's escape attempt had been discovered. A sense of impending doom washed over me, and I struggled to maintain my composure. With minutes to go before 9, I pressed my ear against Nemo's door. Silence. I left my room and went back to the saloon, which was dimly lit and deserted. I opened the door to the library. Same dim light, same emptiness. I positioned myself near the door leading to the central staircase, anxiously awaiting Ned's signal. Then, the propeller's vibrations slowed, then ceased altogether. The silence was absolute, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. A faint jolt told me we had settled on the ocean floor. My anxiety intensified. Ned's signal hadn't come. I had a sudden urge to find him and beg him to postpone the escape. Something felt off, different from our usual routine. The saloon door opened and Captain Nemo appeared. He saw me and without preamble began speaking in a surprisingly affable tone. "Ah, Professor, I've been looking for you. Tell me, are you familiar with Spanish history?" Now, one might be expected to know their own country's history well, but in my current state of mind, I couldn't have recited a single fact. "Well," Nemo persisted, "did you hear my question? Do you know the history of Spain?" "Only vaguely," I mumbled. "So even learned men have things to learn," Nemo said with a chuckle. "Come, sit down, and I'll tell you a fascinating tale from their past. It's a story you'll find quite interesting, Professor, as it may answer a question that's been puzzling you." I listened, unsure of Nemo's intentions and wondering if this had anything to do with our planned escape. "If you don't mind, Professor," Nemo began, "we'll go back to 1702. You're surely aware that your king, Louis XIV, believing a royal decree was enough to bend the Pyrenees to his will, installed his grandson, the Duke of Anjou, as the Spanish monarch. This prince, ruling under the name Philip V, wasn't exactly beloved. In fact, the previous year, the royal houses of Holland, Austria, and England had formed an alliance to remove Philip from power and replace him with an archduke they prematurely named Charles III. Spain had to resist this coalition, Nemo continued, but they were woefully unprepared, lacking both soldiers and ships. Money, however, wasn't an issue, provided their galleons, laden with gold and silver from the Americas, could reach their ports. Around the end of 1702, a treasure-laden convoy escorted by a French fleet of 23 ships under Admiral Chateau Renaud was expected. The coalition's ships were already patrolling the Atlantic, and the convoy was initially headed for Cadiz. However, upon learning of the English fleet's presence, the admiral decided to divert to a French port instead. The Spanish commanders objected, Nemo went on. They insisted on a Spanish port, if not Cadiz, then Vigo Bay on Spain's northwest coast, which was still open. Against his better judgment, Chateau Renaud obeyed, and the galleons sailed into Vigo Bay. Unfortunately, the bay was an open anchorage, virtually impossible to defend. The Spanish had to unload the ships quickly before the combined fleet arrived. They might have succeeded, but a petty dispute arose. "You're following the chain of events?" Nemo asked, turning to me. "Absolutely," I replied, unsure where this history lesson was leading. "Let me continue," Nemo said. "The merchants of Cadiz held a monopoly on all goods arriving from the West Indies. Offloading the treasure at Vigo would violate their rights. They complained to the Spanish court and convinced the easily swayed King Philip to quarantine the convoy in Vigo Bay until the enemy had withdrawn. But while this decision was being made, on October 22nd, 1702, the English fleet arrived at Vigo Bay. Chateau Renaud, despite being outnumbered, fought valiantly. But realizing the treasure was lost, he ordered every galleon burned and scuttled, sending them to the bottom along with their immense riches. Nemo fell silent. He still didn't understand the relevance of this tale. "And?" I prompted. "And Monsieur Aronnax," Nemo said, a sly smile spreading across his face. "We are currently in Vigo Bay. It's up to you whether you wish to explore its secrets." He stood, inviting me to follow. I was still reeling from the revelation, but I obeyed. The saloon was dark, but through the windows, the water sparkled with an otherworldly glow. For half a mile around the Nautilus, the sea was bathed in an electric luminescence. The sandy bottom gleamed, revealing half-rotted crates and barrels scattered amongst the blackened wreckage. Gold and silver ingots, cascades of coins, and glittering jewels spilled from the containers. The sand glittered with treasure. Crewmen in diving suits were busily collecting the riches, returning to the Nautilus to unload their bounty before returning to the underwater bonanza. It all clicked. This was the site of the 1702 battle. Right here, the Spanish treasure galleons had met their watery graves. And here was Captain Nemo, plundering their riches as needed, filling the Nautilus's coffers. For him, and him alone, the Americas had yielded up their precious metals. He was the sole heir to these treasures, stolen from the Incas and the Aztecs by the conquistadors. "Did you know, sir," Nemo asked, his smile widening, "that the sea holds such riches? I was aware that the estimated value of lost treasure in these waters is £2 million, I replied. "Quite so," Nemo agreed, "but recovering it would be a costly endeavor, with expenses outweighing the profits. Here, on the other hand, all I have to do is pick up what man has lost, and not just in Vigo Bay, but in countless other shipwrecks marked on my charts. Can you now comprehend the source of my vast wealth?" "I understand, Captain," I said. "But may I point out that in exploring Vigo Bay, you've merely beaten a rival to the punch." "A rival?" Nemo inquired. "A company that received a salvage permit from the Spanish government to search for these sunken galleons," I explained. "Their investors are lured by the promise of an enormous reward, as they believe the treasure is worth 500 million. 500 million it was," Nemo corrected. "But no longer." "Indeed," I agreed. "Perhaps a warning to those investors would be a charitable act, though who knows if they'd heed it. Gamblers tend to mourn the loss of their illusions more than the loss of their money. Still, I pity them less than the countless people who could benefit from such wealth if it were distributed wisely. For them, it remains forever out of reach." As soon as I'd uttered these words, I sensed I'd struck a nerve with Nemo. "Out of reach!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with passion. "Do you believe these riches are wasted because I collect them? Do you think I hoard them for myself? Who told you I don't put them to good use? Do you think I'm unaware of the suffering and oppression in this world? The countless souls who need solace? The victims who need vengeance? Can't you see?" Nemo stopped abruptly, perhaps regretting his outburst, but I understood. Whatever had driven him to seek refuge in the depths, he was still a man, his heart still connected to the plight of humanity. His extraordinary generosity was not just for individuals, but for entire oppressed populations. And in that moment, I realized the true destination of the millions Nemo had transported while we were in Cretan waters. Chapter 9. A Vanished Continent. The next morning, February 19th, a disheartened Ned Land entered my quarters. I'd been expecting him. "Well, sir?" he said, his disappointment palpable. "Well, Ned," I replied. "Luck wasn't on our side yesterday." "No, it wasn't," he agreed bitterly. "That blasted captain had to stop right when we were planning our exit." "He had business with his bank," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "His bank?" Ned questioned, confused. "Or rather, his vault," I clarified. "By that I mean the ocean, where his riches are far safer than in any government treasury." I recounted the previous night's events, hoping to steer Ned away from the idea of abandoning the captain. But my tale only fueled his regret at having missed out on exploring the Vigo Bay wreckage. "It's not over yet," he declared. "Just a missed shot, that's all. We'll get another chance, tonight if need be." "Where's the Nautilus headed?" I inquired. "No idea," Ned replied, a hint of defiance in his voice. "We'll know by noon when they take our position," I said. Ned returned to Conseil. Once dressed, I headed to the saloon. The compass reading wasn't promising. Our course was southwest, away from Europe. I waited anxiously for the ship's coordinates to be plotted on the map. Around 11:30 a.m., the ballast tanks emptied and we surfaced. I rushed to the deck, Ned already there. There was no land in sight, only the vast, empty ocean. A few distant sails dotted the horizon, likely ships headed for the Cape of Good Hope. The sky was overcast, a storm brewing. Ned paced the deck, frustration radiating from him. He squinted into the hazy distance, clinging to the hope that land might be hiding beyond the fog. The sun briefly emerged at noon, allowing the second officer to take a reading. Then, as the sea grew choppy, we descended, and the hatch sealed shut. An hour later, I checked the chart. Our position was marked at 16 degrees 17 longitude, 33 degrees 22 latitude, 150 leagues from the nearest shore. Escape was impossible. I won't even attempt to describe Ned's fury when I informed him of our predicament. Personally, I felt a sense of relief, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I could now return to my research with a calmer mind. That night, around 11 p.m., I received an unexpected visit from Captain Nemo. He inquired politely if I was tired from the previous night's watch. I assured him I wasn't. "Then, Monsieur Aronnax," he said, "I propose an intriguing excursion." "An excursion, Captain?" I asked, intrigued. "You've only explored the underwater world in daylight," Nemo explained. "Would you like to experience it in the darkness of night?" "Most definitely," I replied, my curiosity piqued. "I must warn you," Nemo cautioned, "it will be a strenuous journey. We'll have to walk quite a distance and even climb a mountain. The paths aren't well maintained." "Your words only heighten my curiosity, Captain," I said. "I'm ready to follow." "Then let's get into our diving suits," Nemo said. In the dressing room, I realized that neither Ned nor Conseil nor any of the crew would be joining us. Nemo hadn't even offered to bring them along. We quickly donned our suits, heavy air tanks strapped to our backs. I noticed there were no electric lamps, and I mentioned this to Nemo. "They won't be necessary," he said simply. I thought I'd misheard, but before I could ask again, Nemo had already sealed his helmet. I finished suiting up, feeling a crewman place an iron-tipped walking stick in my hand. Moments later, we stepped onto the Atlantic seabed, 150 fathoms below the surface. It was nearly midnight and the water was pitch black, but Nemo pointed towards a reddish glow in the distance, a beacon of light about 2 miles away. What this light could be, what fueled it, how it illuminated the dark water, I had no idea. But it did guide our way, however dimly. I quickly adjusted to the darkness and realized why the Ruhmkorff lamps weren't needed. As we walked, a strange tapping sound echoed above me. The noise intensified, turning into a constant drumming. Then it hit me. It was raining heavily on the surface, the raindrops pounding the waves. My first instinct was to worry about getting wet, but then I laughed at the absurdity of the thought. In this thick diving suit, I couldn't even feel the water around me. It was as if I was simply walking through a denser atmosphere. After half an hour, the sandy seafloor became rocky, dotted with the phosphorescent glow of jellyfish, tiny crustaceans, and sea pens. I could see rocks covered in a thick layer of zoophytes and seaweed. My feet often slipped on the slimy carpet, and I would have fallen more than once if not for my walking stick. Looking back, I saw the Nautilus's beacon, a fading white light in the distance, but the reddish glow guiding us grew stronger, painting the horizon in an otherworldly light. The presence of this underwater fire was a complete mystery. Was this a natural phenomenon unknown to science? Or, a more unsettling thought crossed my mind, could it be man-made? Would I encounter Nemo's companions here, fellow exiles who shared his extraordinary underwater existence? Would I discover a hidden colony of those who, weary of the world above, had sought refuge in the ocean depths? All these wild, irrational ideas swirled in my head. In this state of mind, overwhelmed by the constant parade of wonders, I wouldn't have been surprised to stumble upon one of the underwater cities Nemo often spoke of. Our path grew brighter. The white light emanated from the peak of an 800-foot-tall mountain, but it was merely a reflection, amplified by the clear water. The source of the light was a fire burning on the far side of the mountain. Nemo moved confidently through the rocky maze, seemingly familiar with this desolate terrain. He'd clearly traveled this path before, and I followed him with unwavering trust. He seemed like a spirit of the sea, his silhouette stark against the glowing horizon. By 1 a.m., we'd reached the first slopes of the mountain, but to access them, we had to navigate a dense underwater forest. Yes, a graveyard of trees, leafless, sapless, their forms petrified by the water, occasionally dwarfed by towering pines. It was like a coal forest frozen in time, its roots clinging to the fractured earth, its branches like delicate black lace against the watery ceiling above. Imagine a submerged forest from the Harz Mountains, clinging to the slopes, but now swallowed by the sea. We navigated paths choked with seaweed and kelp, teeming with crustaceans. I climbed over rocks, scrambled across fallen trunks, pushed through swaying sea vines, startling fish that flitted from branch to branch. Despite the exertion, I felt no fatigue, keeping pace with Nemo, who moved with tireless energy. The sight was overwhelming, impossible to capture in words. How could I possibly describe the eerie beauty of these woods and rocks, their depths cloaked in shadows, their upper reaches painted in shades of red by the sunlight intensified by the water? We scaled cliffs that crumbled behind us with thunderous roars like underwater avalanches. Long, dark tunnels branched off to the left and right, disappearing into the gloom. Vast, seemingly man-made clearings opened before us, and I couldn't help but wonder if some denizen of this underwater realm would suddenly emerge. Nemo continued his ascent, and I followed. My walking stick proved invaluable on the narrow paths that wound precariously along the edges of deep ravines. I leaped across chasms that would have given me pause on land, traversed fallen logs that bridged the abyss, my eyes fixed on the mesmerizing landscape around me. There were colossal rock formations, balanced precariously on their sculpted bases, defying gravity. Trees sprouted from between their stony knees, supporting others that supported them in turn. Natural towers, sheer cliffs, and structures that leaned at impossible angles, all defying the laws of physics as we knew them on land. 2 hours after leaving the Nautilus, we emerged from the forest. The mountain's peak loomed above us, its shadow stretching across the radiant glow on the opposite slope. Petrified shrubs dotted the landscape like grotesque sculptures. Fish darted beneath our feet, startled by our approach, Massive boulders were riddled with crevices, deep caverns, and unfathomable pits from which strange sounds emanated. I shuddered as enormous antennae barred our path, or a monstrous claw snapped shut in the shadows. Millions of luminous eyes blinked in the darkness, giant crustaceans lurking in their lairs, lobsters like armored warriors, titanic crabs resembling artillery cannons, and horrifying octopuses, their tentacles writhing like a nest of serpents. We finally reached the first plateau, where an even more astonishing sight awaited. Ruins lay before us, unmistakably crafted by human hands. Vast piles of stone formed the vague outlines of castles and temples, now overgrown with vibrant coral and draped in seaweed. What was this submerged civilization? Who built these structures, reminiscent of prehistoric monuments? Where had Nemo brought me? I longed to ask him, but unable to speak, I grabbed his arm. He shook his head and pointed towards the mountain's summit, urging me to follow. Minutes later, we reached the peak. From this vantage point, we could see the entire landscape. The mountain itself wasn't particularly tall, rising only 700 or 800 feet above the surrounding plain. But on the opposite side, it overlooked a vast expanse, bathed in an intense, almost blinding light. The mountain was a volcano. 50 feet above the summit, amidst a shower of ash and molten rock, a gaping crater spewed torrents of lava that cascaded into the sea below. The volcano illuminated the entire plain like a colossal torch, its fiery glow reaching the very limits of the horizon. But while it ejected molten rock, there were no flames. Fire needs oxygen to burn, and there was none to be found underwater. Yet the lava, heated to a blinding white intensity, continued its relentless assault on the ocean, vaporizing everything in its path. Swift currents carried clouds of superheated gas and rivers of lava down the mountain slopes, a scene reminiscent of Vesuvius erupting onto a submerged Pompeii. And there, before my very eyes, lay a city, a ruined, devastated city. Its roofs gaped open, its temples collapsed, its arches broken, its columns toppled. Even in ruins, the massive architecture hinted at its Tuscan origins. Farther on, I could make out the remnants of a gigantic aqueduct, the foundation of an acropolis, the ghostly outline of a Parthenon. There were traces of a quay, as if an ancient harbour had once existed here, swallowed by the sea along with its merchant ships and warships. Beyond that, long stretches of sunken walls and deserted streets, a Pompeii of the deep. This was the spectacle Nemo had brought me to witness. Where was I? I had to know. I tried to speak, but Nemo silenced me with a gesture. He picked up a piece of chalk and, approaching a slab of black basalt, scrawled a single word: Atlantis. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. Atlantis, the legendary lost continent, dismissed by scholars as a myth. And here it was, before my very eyes, bearing undeniable evidence of its catastrophic fate. This submerged realm, once home to the mighty Atlanteans, lay beyond Europe, Asia, and Libya, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where the ancient Greeks had waged their first wars. Guided by an extraordinary destiny, I was walking among the ruins of this lost civilization, touching stones millennia old, relics from a geological epoch long past. I was treading the same ground as the contemporaries of the first humans. As I tried to absorb the details of this breathtaking scene, Nemo remained motionless, as if frozen in silent awe, leaning against a moss-covered rock. Was he dreaming of these vanished generations, seeking answers to the mysteries of human existence? Had this enigmatic man come here to immerse himself in the echoes of history, to relive a life long gone? What wouldn't I have given to know his thoughts, to share in his experience, to understand his motivations? We remained there for an hour, contemplating the vast plains under the otherworldly glow of the lava, which at times intensified dramatically. Tremors shook the mountain as the volcano rumbled deep within the earth, the sounds magnified by the water. The moon emerged from behind a veil of clouds, casting its pale light upon the drowned city. It was only a glimpse, but the effect was breathtaking. Nemo stood, taking one last look at the sprawling ruins. Then, he beckoned me to follow. We descended the mountain quickly. Once past the petrified forest, the Nautilus's beacon shone like a star in the distance. Nemo headed straight for it, and we were back on board as the first rays of dawn pierced the surface of the ocean. Chapter 10: The Submarine Coal Mines. I woke up late on February 20th, the previous night's exertions having kept me asleep until 11. I quickly dressed and went to check the Nautilus's course. The instruments indicated we were still heading south at 20 knots, maintaining a depth of 50 fathoms. The fish here weren't much different from those we'd already encountered. There were enormous rays, 15 feet long, their powerful muscles propelling them through the water. A variety of sharks, including one 15-footer with triangular teeth, so transparent as to render it nearly invisible, and, as Conseil noted, some 10-foot-long bony fish with spear-like projections from their upper jaws. These were the sea dragons, described by Aristotle, known to be dangerous due to their sharp dorsal spines. Around 4 p.m., the seabed, previously a mix of thick silt and petrified wood, gradually shifted, becoming rockier. We encountered conglomerates, chunks of basalt and traces of lava. It seemed we were leaving the plains behind and entering a mountainous region. After a series of maneuvers, a high wall appeared on the southern horizon, blocking our path. Its peak clearly extended above sea level. Was it a continent, an island, one of the Canaries or Cape Verde Islands? Without our precise coordinates, I couldn't be sure. But whatever it was, it seemed to mark the boundary of that submerged Atlantis, of which we had explored only a fraction. I would have lingered at the window, admiring the underwater scenery, but the panels closed. The Nautilus came to a halt beside the towering wall. I had no idea what Nemo intended to do, so I returned to my quarters. The ship remained stationary. I lay down, planning to nap for a few hours, but when I awoke, it was 8 o'clock the next morning. I checked the depth gauge. We were on the surface. I heard footsteps on the deck above and went to the observation panel. It was open, but instead of daylight, I was enveloped in pitch darkness. Where were we? Was I still dreaming? Had night somehow returned without a single star in the sky? Confused, I heard a voice behind me. "Is that you, Professor?" "Captain," I exclaimed. "Where are we?" "Underground, sir," Nemo replied calmly. "Underground?" I echoed, incredulous. "And the Nautilus is still afloat?" "It always floats, but I don't understand." "Just wait a few minutes," Nemo assured me. "Our lights will come on soon, and if you're fond of well-lit spaces, you'll be quite satisfied." I waited on the deck. The darkness was so complete that I couldn't even see Nemo. As I looked up, I noticed a faint glimmer of twilight filtering through a circular opening directly overhead. Suddenly, the deck lights blazed on, and their brilliance banished the dimness. I shielded my eyes, blinking until they adjusted. The Nautilus was indeed afloat, nestled beside a mountain that formed a natural dock. We were in a lake, a circular body of water enclosed by towering walls 2 miles in diameter. The depth gauge showed that the lake's surface was level with the surrounding sea, suggesting an underwater connection. The massive walls converged overhead, forming a vaulted ceiling that resembled an inverted funnel, 500 or 600 yards high. At the apex was a circular opening, the source of the dim light I'd seen earlier. "Where are we?" I repeated, still mystified. "In the heart of an extinct volcano," Nemo explained. Its interior flooded by the sea after some cataclysmic geological event. While you were asleep, Professor, the Nautilus entered this lagoon through a natural channel about 30 feet below the surface. This is our hidden harbor, safe, convenient, and completely concealed. Show me another location on any continent or island that offers such perfect shelter from storms." "You're certainly safe here, Captain Nemo," I agreed. Who could possibly reach you inside a volcano? But didn't I see an opening at the top? Yes, the crater, Nemo said. Once filled with lava, steam and fire, it now provides us with fresh air. What is this volcanic mountain? I inquired. It's one of the many islands scattered across this sea. To most ships, it's merely a sandbar, but to us, it's a vast cavern. Chance led me to its discovery, and chance has served me well. But what purpose does this refuge serve, Captain? I asked. The Nautilus doesn't require a port. True, Nemo replied, but it does require electricity for propulsion, and electricity requires sodium. Sodium, in turn, is derived from coal, which we obtain from a coal mine. And it just so happens that this very spot contains entire forests submerged during prehistoric times, now fossilized and transformed into coal. For me, it's an inexhaustible supply. So your men work as miners here? I asked. Precisely, Nemo confirmed. These underwater mines rival those of Newcastle. My men, equipped with diving suits, picks and shovels, extract the coal that I no longer need to obtain from land. When I burn this fuel to produce sodium, the smoke escaping from the crater makes the volcano appear active. Will we get to see your men at work? I asked eagerly. Not this time, I'm afraid, Nemo replied. We're in a hurry to continue our journey around the world. I'll simply replenish our sodium reserves from my existing stockpile. The loading process takes only a day, and then we'll be on our way. So, if you wish to explore the cavern and the lagoon, Monsieur Aronnax, you must do so today. I thanked the captain and went to fetch my companions, who were still in their cabins. I invited them to follow me without revealing our location. They climbed onto the deck. Conseil, unsurprised as always, seemed to think it perfectly normal to wake up inside a mountain after falling asleep under the sea. But Ned, ever practical, was immediately focused on finding a way out of the cavern. The volcanic origin of this enormous cavern was evident, and I pointed it out to my companions. Imagine, I said, what this crater must have been like when it was filled with molten lava, the fiery liquid rising to the very top like something boiling over on a stove. I can picture it, Conseil replied. But Professor, why has the great architect ceased his work? How is it that a peaceful lake now occupies this once fiery furnace? Most likely, Conseil, I theorized, some subterranean upheaval created the very opening the Nautilus used to enter this lagoon. Atlantic waters rushed in, and a titanic battle ensued between the two elements, ending in Neptune's victory. Eons have passed since then, transforming this submerged volcano into a tranquil grotto. Fair enough, Ned said. I accept your explanation, Professor. But speaking selfishly, I wish that opening had been above sea level. But Ned, my friend, Conseil countered. If the passage weren't underwater, the Nautilus couldn't have used it. We continued our ascent, path growing steeper and narrower. Deep fissures forced us to scramble and crawl, but Conseil's agility and Ned's strength saw us through. At a height of about 30 feet, the terrain changed, but not for the better. The conglomerate and trachyte gave way to black basalt, some in layers full of air pockets, others forming perfect columns that seemed to support the immense vaulted ceiling above. A stunning example of natural architecture. Long cooled streams of lava snaked between the basalt blocks, their surfaces encrusted with a bituminous sheen. In some spots, vast carpets of sulfur stretched out before us. A brighter light filtered down from the crater above, casting an ethereal glow on these volcanic formations, forever entombed within the dormant mountain. Our upward trek was halted at about 250 feet by an impassable obstacle, a solid arch of rock. We were forced to change course, circling the perimeter instead. Here, plant life began to compete with the mineral world. Shrubs and even trees sprouted from cracks in the rock walls. I recognized euphorbias, dripping their caustic sap, and heliotropes, their faded flowers a pale imitation of their sun-loving namesakes. Here and there, timid chrysanthemums, huddled at the base of sickly aloes. But amid the lava flows, I spotted delicate violets, still faintly fragrant. I inhaled their perfume with delight. Scent is the soul of a flower. And these sea flowers, for all their beauty, were soulless. We reached a cluster of sturdy dragon trees, their roots having forced their way through the rocks. Suddenly, Ned exclaimed, "Professor, a beehive! A beehive! A beehive!" I repeated, incredulous. "Yes, sir, a hive," Ned insisted, "and bees buzzing all around it." I approached cautiously and was astonished by what I saw. At a hole in one of the dragon trees, thousands of bees, the same industrious insects found throughout the Canary Islands, known for their prized honey, were swarming. Ned, naturally, wanted to collect the honey, and I didn't see a reason to object. He gathered dry leaves and sulfur, ignited them with a spark from his flint, and began to smoke out the bees. The buzzing gradually subsided, and the hive eventually yielded several pounds of the sweetest honey, which Ned eagerly stuffed into his satchel. "Once I mix this honey with breadfruit paste," he declared, "I'll bake you a delicious cake." "More like gingerbread, I'd say," Conseil chimed in. "Gingerbread or not," I said, "let's continue our fascinating walk." The path wound around the mountain, offering us breathtaking views of the lake at every turn. The lantern illuminated its tranquil surface, undisturbed by even the slightest ripple. The Nautilus rested silently in the distance, its crew working on the deck and the mountainside, their figures like black silhouettes against the glowing atmosphere. We reached the highest ridge of the first rock layer, the one that supported the ceiling. I realized then that bees weren't the only creatures inhabiting this volcano. Birds of prey soared through the shadows or took flight from their nests on the cliff faces. There were white-breasted sparrowhawks, kestrels, and plump bustards sprinting down the slopes. I could only imagine Ned's frustration at not having a gun. He tried his luck with stones instead, and after several misses, managed to wound a magnificent bird, adding it to his honey-laden satchel at considerable risk to himself. The path became impassable, forcing us to descend towards the shore. The crater loomed above, a dark abyss. From this vantage point, we could clearly see the sky, with clouds scattered by the westerly wind, their wispy remnants lingering even at the summit. This confirmed that the volcano's peak wasn't particularly high, rising no more than 800 feet above sea level. Half an hour after Ned's last exploit, we returned to the lake's edge. Here, the flora consisted mainly of vast fields of sea fennel, a small flowering plant ideal for pickling. Conseil gathered a few bundles. The fauna was abundant, thousands of crustaceans of every variety, lobsters, crabs, spider crabs, even shrimp that changed color like chameleons, along with countless shells, rockfish, and limpets. 3/4 of an hour later, we completed our circuit and returned to the Nautilus. The crew had finished loading the sodium, and the ship was ready to depart. But Nemo gave no such order. Was he waiting until nightfall to leave this secret haven? Perhaps. Whatever his reasoning, the next morning, the Nautilus departed, diving deep beneath the Atlantic waves, leaving all land far behind. Chapter 1: The Sargasso Sea. That day, the Nautilus traversed a unique region of the Atlantic, the Sargasso Sea. This isn't just any stretch of ocean. It's a massive, self-contained ecosystem, a vast, slow-moving whirlpool of warm water encircled by the Gulf Stream. It takes the current a full 3 years to complete its circuit. Nemo, not wanting to risk fouling the propellers in the dense vegetation, kept the Nautilus submerged a few fathoms below the surface. We glided through an underwater meadow, a thick carpet of seaweed, sargassum, and floating berries so dense a ship's hull would struggle to break through. The name Sargasso comes from the Spanish word for kelp, sargazo, which is the primary component of this immense floating island. Maury, the oceanographer, theorized that the Sargasso Sea forms due to the circular motion of the Gulf Stream. It's like swirling a bowl of water with bits of cork floating in it. The cork pieces eventually clump together in the center, the calmest part of the bowl. In this analogy, the Atlantic is the bowl, the Gulf Stream is the swirling current, and the Sargasso Sea is the collection point for the debris. I agreed with Maury's assessment, having now experienced this phenomenon firsthand. Above us floated all manner of objects trapped in the brown seaweed, tree trunks ripped from the Andes or the Rockies and carried out to sea by the Amazon or the Mississippi. Countless shipwrecks, their hulls encrusted with barnacles and shells, too heavy to ever rise again. Maury had even predicted that over time, these accumulated materials would become fossilized and form coal deposits, a resource for future generations when the Earth's land-based mines were exhausted. Amidst this tangled mass, I spotted delicate pink halcyons, anemones trailing their long tentacles, and jellyfish in vibrant shades of green, red, and blue. We spent the entire day of February 22nd traversing the Sargasso Sea, a haven for fish that feed on marine vegetation. The next day, the ocean returned to its familiar open expanse. For the next 19 days, from February 23rd to March 12th, the Nautilus cruised through the central Atlantic at a constant speed of 100 leagues per day. And Nemo seemed determined to complete his underwater circumnavigation, and I suspected he intended to return to the Pacific via Cape Horn. This was a troubling prospect for Ned. In these vast, empty waters, escape would be impossible. We were powerless to resist Nemo's will. Our only hope, I reasoned, lay in persuasion. Perhaps, once this journey was complete, Nemo would agree to release us, on our word of honor to never reveal his existence. We would have to raise this delicate subject with him at the appropriate time. But did I even have the right to ask for our freedom? Hadn't Nemo made it abundantly clear from the outset that the secret of his life required our permanent confinement aboard the Nautilus? Wouldn't my 4 months of silence be interpreted as tacit acceptance of our fate? Bringing up the topic of freedom now could arouse suspicion, jeopardizing any future escape attempts. During those 19 uneventful days, I rarely saw Captain Nemo. He was engrossed in his work, leaving his books on natural history open in the library, their pages filled with his meticulous annotations. My own manuscript on the undersea world, which he'd perused, was covered in margin notes, often challenging my theories and conclusions. But Nemo rarely discussed them with me directly. Occasionally, I heard the mournful strains of his organ, played only at night in the deepest darkness, when the Nautilus slumbered in the vast empty ocean. During this leg of our journey, we spent entire days on the surface. The sea seemed deserted, save for a few sailing ships bound for India, making their way towards the Cape of Good Hope. Once, we were even pursued by the boats of a whaler who likely mistook us for a colossal valuable whale. But Nemo, not wanting to waste their time, ended the chase by diving beneath the waves. Our voyage continued until March 13th. On that day, the Nautilus began taking depth soundings, a process that intrigued me greatly. We had now traveled roughly 13,000 leagues since leaving the Pacific. Our coordinates placed us at 45 degrees 37 S latitude and 37 degrees 53 W longitude. This was the same region where Captain Denham of the Herald had lowered a sounding line 35,000 feet without reaching the bottom, and where Lieutenant Parker of the American frigate Congress had failed to touch bottom at an even greater depth. Nemo intended to plumb the ocean's depths using a weighted line deployed at a 45-degree angle from the Nautilus. The propellers roared to life, their blades churning the water with tremendous force. Under this immense pressure, the hull of the Nautilus shuddered like a taut wire as it descended steadily into the abyss. 35,000 feet, I glimpsed dark peaks rising from the inky depths. But these could have been the summits of mountains as tall as the Himalayas, or even Everest. The true depth of this chasm remained a mystery. The Nautilus continued its descent, defying the crushing pressure. I felt the steel plates vibrating against their rivets, the metal groaning under the strain. The saloon windows seemed to bow inward. Surely this robust vessel would have buckled if not for its remarkable strength, as Nemo had boasted. We reached a depth of 50,000 feet, 4 leagues, where the pressure on the Nautilus's hull was a mind-boggling 1,600 atmospheres, equivalent to 3,200 pounds per square inch. "What a situation to be in," I exclaimed, "to explore these uncharted depths where no human has ever ventured. Look, Captain, look at these magnificent rocks, these untouched grottos. This is the Earth's final frontier, a place where life itself seems impossible. What unimaginable sights we behold. Why shouldn't we capture these images for posterity?" "Would you like to preserve more than just memories?" Nemo asked, a sly grin spreading across his face. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "I'm suggesting we take a photograph of this underwater realm," Nemo explained. Before I could express my astonishment, a camera was brought into the saloon at Nemo's command. Through the open panel, the water glowed brightly with our electric lights, their illumination so uniform that not a single shadow marred the scene. The Nautilus hovered motionless, its propellers idle, its angle of descent maintained by its hydroplanes. The camera was positioned on the ocean floor, and within seconds, we had captured a perfect image. "Let's ascend," Nemo said once the operation was complete. "We shouldn't push our luck or expose the Nautilus to this immense pressure for too long." "Go up?" I questioned, surprised by the sudden change of plans. "Hold on tight," Nemo warned. Before I could ask why, I was thrown forward onto the carpet as the Nautilus, propellers whirring, shot upwards like a rocket. We breached the surface in a mere 4 minutes, soaring out of the water like a flying fish and sending a massive wave crashing outwards.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Quantum Dispatches, and stay tuned next week for another thrilling adventure. Thank you for listening.